She came to Ashmore Crossing answering an ad for a farmhand, and found a dying ranch, a broken man, and a town betting she'd be gone within a week. Maris Holloway had already buried a husband and a city life that chewed her up and spat her out. She wasn't running from hardship anymore. She was done running, period. If you're watching this, hit like, drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels together. This is the story of a woman who refused to let one more failure define her. The stagecoach driver didn't slow down so much as he simply gave up trying to go any faster, letting the horses walk the last half mile into Ashmore Crossing, like even they knew there wasn't any reason to hurry toward a place like this. Maris Holloway sat with her back straight and her gloved hands folded over a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world, which, by that point, wasn't much. A few dresses, a cracked photograph. $11 sewn into the lining of her coat because a woman traveling alone learned fast that you didn't keep your money where anybody could see it. She watched the town come into view through a window streaked with dust, and what came into view didn't look like much of a town at all. A general store with a porch that sagged in the middle like it had given up holding itself together. A church with no bell. A saloon that looked like the only building in Ashmore Crossing anybody had bothered to keep standing straight, which told her plenty about what kept this place breathing. "This is it," the driver said, not turning around. "Ashmore Crossing. End of the line, ma'am." "I gathered that," Maris said. He brought the coach to a stop in front of the store, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on a person's chest a little. She climbed out herself because the driver didn't seem inclined to help, and her boots hit the dirt road and sent up a small cloud of dust that hung in the air a moment too long, like even the dust here had nowhere better to be. A few people stood along the porch of the store. Not many. A woman with flour on her apron and tired eyes that moved over Maris from her boots to her bonnet and back down again, cataloging her like a piece of furniture nobody had ordered. Two old men sitting on overturned crates who stopped talking the second the coach pulled up and didn't start again. A boy of maybe 10 who just stared, unashamed, the way children do before anyone teaches them not to. "You'd be the one answering Rowan's notice," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Maris Holloway." She extended a hand, out of habit more than hope. The woman didn't take it. "Bertie Lunsford, I run the store." A pause, long enough to be deliberate. "You know what you're walking into, Mrs. Holloway?" "I know what the notice said." Notice didn't say the half of it. Bertie wiped her hands on her apron, though they weren't dirty. "Rowan's place has chewed through 3 hired women in 2 years. Last one left in the middle of the night. Didn't even take her wages." One of the old men on the crates let out a dry laugh that turned into a cough. "Tell her about the fences, Bertie." "I'm getting to the fences." "What about the fences?" Maris asked. "There aren't any," the old man said, like that settled the matter. "Not one's worth the name." Maris looked past the store, past the handful of buildings that made up the entirety of Ashmore Crossing, out toward the hills where the land rolled brown and dry under a sky that hadn't given up real rain in longer than anyone wanted to admit. Somewhere out there was a ranch and a man named Garrick Rowan, and somewhere in her carpet bag was $11 and a letter confirming she had a job, assuming the man hadn't changed his mind by the time she arrived. "I'll need a way out there," she said. Bertie studied her another moment, the kind of look a person gives someone they expect to be wrong about, almost wanting to be wrong about it. "Tobias can take you. He's headed that direction with feed." She nodded toward a lanky young man loading sacks onto a wagon a few yards off, who looked up at the sound of his name with the expression of someone who hadn't volunteered for this. "I'd appreciate that," Maris said. "Don't thank me yet," Bertie said. "Thank me if you're still out there in a month." The wagon ride took the better part of an hour, the road narrowing from a road into something closer to a suggestion, ruts deep enough to rattle Maris's teeth. Tobias didn't talk much, which she didn't mind because it gave her time to look at the land they passed through, land that had clearly once been worked hard and worked well, the bones of old irrigation ditches still visible under the dust, fence posts standing crooked and gray like teeth in an old man's mouth. Here and there, a stretch of fence wire sagging so low a child could have stepped over it. "Drought's been bad," Tobias finally said, like he felt obligated to offer something. "How long?" "Going on 3 years now. Worse some years than others. This past one's been about the worst." He glanced at her sideways. "You sure you want this job, ma'am? Town's been talking about it since the notice went up." Nobody figured anyone would actually come. I came, Maris said simply. Yes, ma'am, I can see that. They crested a low rise, and the ranch came into view below them in the fading afternoon light. And Maris felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with the dust in the air. The house sat at the center of it, a two-story structure that had probably been handsome once, white paint long since given up to gray, a porch missing two of its support posts so that the roof tilted at an angle that made the whole place look like a man leaning on a cane he didn't quite trust. The barn beside it had a hole in the roof you could see daylight through from 100 yards off. The fences, what fences there were, ran in broken, half-hearted lines across pastures that held more dirt than grass, and scattered across those pastures were cattle so thin their ribs showed through dull, patchy hides. It was, without question, the worst piece of land Maris had ever laid eyes on, and she didn't look away from it, not for 1 second. That's it, Tobias said, the way a man says something he's apologizing for without quite saying the words. That's Rowan's place. It's exactly what I expected, Maris said, which was a lie, because nothing could have fully prepared her for the sight of it, but it was the kind of lie that steadied her better than the truth would have. A man came out of this barn as the wagon approached, wiping his hands on a rag that looked dirtier than whatever he'd been trying to clean off them, and Maris understood immediately that this was Garrick Rowan, because nobody else could have looked that tired and that stubborn at the same time. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd done hard labor his whole life, though there was a leanness to him now that spoke of meals skipped more often than not. His face was sun-worn, lined deeper than his years should have allowed, dark hair gone a little too long, and a beard a little too unkempt, like grooming had stopped being a priority somewhere around the same time Hope had. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at Maris with an expression that gave away almost nothing, which she would come to learn was simply how the man looked at everything. "You're the woman from the notice," he said. Not a question, same as Bertie. Maris Holloway. She climbed down from the wagon before he could offer a hand he clearly wasn't going to offer. "I'm here about the position." His eyes moved over her the way Bertie's had, though without the same edge of judgment, more like a man doing an inventory, checking what he had to work with. "You're smaller than I figured." "I work the same regardless of size, Mr. Rowan." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe? Or the closest thing to amusement a man that tired could manage. "Garrick," he said. "Mr. Rowan makes me sound like my father, and he's been dead 11 years. Garrick, then." She glanced past him at the barn, the house, the pastures, taking it all in with the same flat, assessing look she imagined he'd just given her. "I won't pretend I expected it to look like this." "Nobody does." He said it without bitterness, just fact, the way a man states the weather. 3 women have stood right where you're standing and said about the same thing, and all 3 of them were gone inside a month. "I'm not them." "That's what they said too." Tobias cleared his throat from the wagon seat. "I'll just unload the feed then, if that's all right." "Go ahead," Garrick said, and the young man hopped down to start hauling sacks toward the barn, clearly relieved to have something to do besides stand there feeling the tension that had settled over the yard like dust that hadn't decided where to land. Garrick studied Maris a moment longer. "You got people somewhere? Family that'll come looking if this doesn't work out?" "No," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no softening. "My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him inside of a week. I had a position in the city after that, working a hotel laundry, until the owner decided he'd rather hire men at half the wage I was asking and twice the trouble. I answered your notice because it was the only one that didn't ask me to bring a husband along as a condition of employment." Something shifted in Garrick's expression at that, some small recognition passing behind his eyes. "Sorry about your husband." "I'm sorry about whatever happened here," she said, nodding toward the house, the barn, all of it. "Though I expect you'd rather I not bring it up twice a day." "I'd rather you not bring it up at all," he said, but there wasn't real sharpness in it, more like a man drawing a line he needed drawn. The notice said room, board, and wages for managing the property. Cooking, keeping the house, helping with what stock we've got left. I won't lie and tell you it's light work. I won't lie and tell you the place is in good shape. You can see that for yourself." "I can," Maris agreed. "How bad is it, really? Not what the town says. What you know." He was quiet a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to give her the truth or the easier version of it. To his credit, he chose the truth. Bad, he said. We lost most of the herd 2 winters back to a sickness that came through, and what's left is thin because the grass won't grow enough to feed them proper. Droughts killed 2 harvests running. I owe the bank in Calder's Ridge more than this place is worth if I sold every board and every cow tomorrow. My wife passed 3 years back, and since then I haven't had it in me to fix what needs fixing, not the way I should have. He said all of it flatly, like a man reciting a list he'd memorized out of necessity rather than choice. That's the truth of it. If you want to climb back in that wagon, I won't think less of you. Maris looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked past him again, at the crooked porch and the sagging barn roof, and the cattle too thin to be called healthy, and something settled in her that felt less like a decision and more like a door closing behind her, the kind that didn't open back up. I didn't come all this way to climb back in a wagon, she said. Show me the house. He blinked, like that wasn't the response he'd expected. That's it? No more questions? I've got plenty of questions. I'll ask them as they come up. She picked up her carpet bag from where Tobias had set it down. Right now, I'd like to see where I'll be sleeping and where I'll be cooking, because the sun's going down, and I imagine you haven't eaten a proper meal in longer than you'd care to admit. For the first time since she'd arrived, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of Garrick's mouth, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. No, he admitted. I haven't. The inside of the house was, if anything, a worse confirmation of everything the outside had promised. Dust lay thick over surfaces that hadn't been wiped down in longer than Maris wanted to guess. The kitchen held a stove with 1 working burner and a pantry with more empty shelf than full. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, one clearly Garrick's, sparse and undisturbed in a way that spoke of a man who slept poorly and didn't care much about comfort, and another, smaller room at the end of the hall that had belonged, she guessed without asking, to his late wife, the door to it shut, and the dust on its handle thicker than anywhere else in the house, like nobody had touched it in years. That one's not in use, Garrick said when he caught her looking at the closed door, his voice gone tight and final, in a way that told her not to ask further. I wasn't going to take it, Maris said. Is there another room? Small one downstairs off the kitchen? Used to be for hired help back when we had hired help that stayed long enough to need a room. He led her down and showed her, and it was small indeed, barely enough space for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, but it had a window that looked out over the back pasture and the hills beyond, and Maris decided right then that it would do fine. This is good, she said. It's small. It's mine for now. That's good enough. She set her carpet bag on the bed and turned to face him fully. Now, tell me what you've got in that pantry, and tell me when you last had a meal that wasn't beans out of a can, and then get out of my kitchen so I can put something together before it's too dark to see straight. Garrick stared at her, and for a moment she wondered if she'd overstepped, spoken too plainly to a man who was, after all, the one paying her wages. But then he let out a short, surprised breath of a laugh, the first real sound of amusement she'd heard from him. 3 days, he said. Since I had a meal that wasn't beans, I mean. Lord, Maris muttered, then caught herself because she'd been raised not to take that name in vain, even in frustration, and corrected to, Mercy. All right. Beans then, but I'll see what else is here and make it stretch into something that resembles a supper. What she found in this pantry was sparse but workable. A sack of cornmeal, a slab of salt pork gone a little too dry at the edges, but still good. Some wild onions, Garrick said, grew along the creek bed if a person knew where to look, and a handful of dried beans that, true to his word, seemed to make up the bulk of his recent diet. She set to work without further conversation, and Garrick, after standing in the kitchen doorway a moment too long like a man who'd forgotten how to be in a room with another person cooking, excused himself to finish whatever chores remained before full dark. She cooked by the light of a single lamp, and the smell of the cornbread baking and the salt pork frying filled the kitchen with something that felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, almost like a home, even if it was someone else's home, and even if that someone else was a stranger she'd met only hours before. He came back in as she was setting the table, and he stopped just inside the door, looking at the spread laid out, not much by any city standard, but more than beans, and clearly more than he'd expected. You did all that with what was in my pantry? And a few onions you didn't know you had growing wild, she said. Sit down before it goes cold. He sat. He ate the way a starving man eats when he's trying not to look like a starving man, careful at first, then faster, like his body overruled whatever manners he'd been holding on to. Maris ate slower, watching him without making it obvious she was watching him, taking the measure of the man she'd be working for in the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for the bread, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the dark window like he expected something out there to come looking for him. "This is good," he said finally, after his plate was nearly clean. "Better than good. I don't—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right words and not quite find them. "I don't remember the last time I sat down to a meal like this." "When did your wife pass?" Maris asked gently, though she half expected him to shut the conversation down the way he had over the bedroom door. He didn't, though. He just looked at his plate for a long moment. 3 years this past spring. Fever, same as your husband, I'd guess, from the way you said it. Took her in about a week. We hadn't been married but 4 years. He set his fork down. "Eleanor." Her name was Eleanor. "I'm sorry," Maris said, and meant it. "Everybody's sorry," Garrick said, not unkindly, just tired. "Sorry doesn't bring the rain back. Sorry doesn't pay the bank. After a while, you stop wanting to hear it, because it doesn't change anything. It just makes the other person feel like they did something by saying it." "Then I won't say it again," Maris said. "I'll just say this instead. I'm not here to feel sorry for you, Garrick Rowan. I'm here to work. And from what I've seen of this place so far, there's plenty of work to be done, and not much time left to waste feeling sorry about any of it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. "The other 3 women who came out here," he said slowly, "they cried, the first week. 2 of them, anyway. The 3rd one just got angry, packed her bag inside 3 days, said the place was cursed, and she wasn't sticking around to find out what came next." "I'm not going to cry," Maris said, "and I don't believe in curses. I believe in drought and debt and bad luck and bad management, and all of those things can be fixed by somebody willing to put in the work, given enough time and enough stubbornness. I've got plenty of both." "You haven't even seen the worst of it yet," Garrick said. "Wait till morning, then you tell me you're still not scared off." "I won't be," Maris said, and there was something in the flat certainty of her voice that made him believe her, even though every other woman who'd sat at that table had said something close to the same thing before the place broke them. Morning came hard and early, the way mornings did on a working ranch, and Maris was up before the sun had fully cleared the hills, dressed in her plainest clothes, hair pulled back tight, ready to see the full truth of what she'd signed on for. What she found, walking the property in the gray early light, with Garrick a few steps ahead of her, silent and watchful, was worse than what the dusk light had shown her the evening before, because daylight didn't hide anything. The barn's roof had more holes than she'd realized, patches of sky visible in 3 separate places, and inside the stalls held only a handful of animals. 4 horses, one of them limping badly, and a scattering of cattle in a holding pen that looked, in the unforgiving morning light, less like livestock and more like the ghosts of livestock, ribs and hip bones pushing against hides gone dull and patchy. "This is what's left?" Maris asked, unable to keep the shock fully out of her voice despite her resolve. "This is what's left," Garrick confirmed. "Had near 60 head 3 years back. Sickness took most of them the winter Eleanor died. Sold off what I could to cover the doctor's bills and the burial, and what's left has just been getting thinner every season since, because the grass won't grow enough to feed them, and I can't afford feed enough to make up the difference." "And the fences?" "Don't get me started on the fences," he said, with the first real flash of frustration she'd seen cross his face. 3 miles of fence line on this property, and I'd guess maybe a third of it's still standing proper. The rest is rotted through, or knocked down, or just gone. Posts pulled up for firewood 2 winters back when I couldn't afford coal, and the nights got bad enough that pride stopped mattering." They walked the perimeter of the near pasture, and Maris saw with her own eyes what he meant. Fence posts leaning at angles that defied explanation, wire sagging low enough that the thin cattle simply stepped over it when they felt like wandering, gaps wide enough to drive a wagon through in places where the wood had simply rotted away to nothing. "How do you keep the cattle from wandering off entirely?" she asked. "Mostly I don't," Garrick admitted. "I lose a few head a season to wandering. Coyotes get some of those. Rest just go where the grass looks better, which isn't hard, since most everything on this land looks better than what's right here." Maris stood at the edge of the pasture for a long moment, looking out over the whole sorry mess of it. The broken fences, the thin cattle, the cracked earth where grass should have been thick and green, the barn with its rotted roof, the house leaning on its broken porch posts behind them. It was, by any reasonable measure, a hopeless situation. The kind of thing a sensible person would walk away from without a second thought. But Maris had spent 2 years being told, in one way or another, by landlords and employers and the cold indifference of city streets, that she didn't have what it took to make her own way in the world, that a widow without family or means was meant to disappear quietly into someone else's household and be grateful for the scraps of charity thrown her way. She'd grown tired of being told what she couldn't do, and standing there, looking at the worst piece of land she'd ever seen in her life, something stubborn and a little bit furious settled into her chest, and she decided with the same flat certainty she'd decided everything else since stepping off that stagecoach, that she was going to fix this. Not because the land deserved saving, and not even entirely for Garrick Rowan's sake, though she found she didn't dislike the man, tired and broken down as he was. She was going to fix it because she refused, flatly, completely refused, to let one more piece of bad luck win. "All right," she said, turning to face him. "All right what?" "All right, I see it. The whole sorry shape of it, and I'm not leaving." She said it the way a person states a fact rather than makes a promise, which carried more weight somehow than a promise would have. "But if I'm staying, things are going to change around here, starting today, and I'd rather you know that now than be surprised by it later." Garrick studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and a wariness that had clearly been earned the hard way. "Change how?" "For one, that barn roof gets patched before the next rain because every hole in it is rot waiting to spread, and rot spreads to the beams, and rotted beams bring the whole roof down eventually, and then you've lost the barn entirely instead of just patched it. For another, we go through every inch of fence on this property and figure out what can be salvaged with what's lying around versus what needs new material we don't have money to buy. And for a third," she paused, looking back toward the thin cattle in their pen, "those cattle aren't going to fatten up on hope. What feed do you have? And what feed can you get without spending money you don't have?" Garrick was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Maris wondered if she'd pushed too hard, too fast, on her very first morning. But when he spoke, his voice had something in it that hadn't been there the day before. Not quite hope, because the man seemed too cautious, too worn down to let himself feel something as risky as hope, but something adjacent to it, something like attention. "You talk like you've done this kind of work before," he said. "I haven't," Maris admitted. "Not exactly this. But I grew up on a farm before my family lost it, back before I married, and I learned plenty watching my father try to hold on to something that was slipping away from him no matter how hard he worked. I learned what works and what doesn't. I learned that sometimes the answer isn't more money, because you don't have more money. The answer is using what you've got smarter than the problem expects you to." "My father used to say something like that," Garrick said, almost to himself. "Before he died. Said the land doesn't care how much money a man's got, only how much sense he's got." "Your father sounds like he was right." "He was right about plenty of things and wrong about plenty of others," Garrick said. "Same as most men, I'd guess." He looked back out over the pasture, the fences, the thin cattle, the whole sorry mess of it, and something in his shoulders shifted, not quite straightening, but no longer quite as bowed down as they'd been a moment before. "All right, Mrs. Holloway, you want to fix fence and patch roofs and stretch feed that doesn't exist into enough to fatten cattle on. Where do we start?" "We start," Maris said, "by you calling me Maris, because Mrs. Holloway makes this sound a great deal more formal than it's going to be once you've watched me up to my elbows in tar trying to patch your barn roof. And we start with the roof, because rain's coming eventually, drought or no drought, and I'd rather lose a day to roofing now than lose the whole barn to rot later." They worked through that first full day with an intensity that surprised them both. Garrick fetched what tar and scrap shingle he had stored in the loft, materials left over from some half-finished repair attempted years before and abandoned, and together they climbed onto the barn roof and began the slow, careful work of patching the worst of the holes. It was hard, hot work, the sun climbing high and merciless by midday, and Maris's hands blistered inside an hour despite the gloves she wore. But she didn't say a word about it, just kept working, matching Garrick's pace, and if he noticed the way she winced when she gripped the hammer too hard, he didn't comment on it either, just passed her the lighter tool without making a show of the gesture. "You don't have to keep up with me," he said at one point, watching her drag a heavy bundle of scrap shingle across the roof. I'm not trying to keep up with you, Maris said, dropping the bundle where he'd indicated. I'm trying to get the work done. There's a difference. He almost smiled at that. Almost. By the time the sun started sinking low enough to paint the sky orange and gold, they'd patched the 3 worst holes in the barn roof, leaving smaller gaps for another day. And Maris's whole body ached in a way that felt strangely satisfying rather than defeating. The kind of ache that came from work actually done, progress actually made, however small. They ate supper that evening in something close to companionable silence. The awkwardness of the day before having worn away somewhat under the shared labor, and afterward, as Maris cleared the plates, Garrick lingered at the table longer than he had the night before. Eleanor used to say the same thing, he said, apropos of nothing, staring at some point on the table that wasn't really there. About using what you've got smarter than the problem expects. She had a way of looking at a mess and seeing the parts of it that could be saved, instead of just seeing the mess. He paused. I haven't thought about that in a long while. Funny, the things that come back to a man. It's not funny, Maris said, setting the plates in the basin. It's just memory doing what memory does. Comes back when something stirs it loose. You stirred something loose, Garrick said, and then seemed almost embarrassed by the admission, clearing his throat and standing abruptly. I'll check on the horses before turning in. That one's been favoring her left foreleg, and I want to make sure it's not worse. I'll see you in the morning then, Maris said, and he nodded and was gone, out into the deepening dark toward the barn, and Maris stood alone in the dim kitchen for a long moment, listening to the quiet of a house that had been, until yesterday, occupied by a single grieving man, and was now, for better or worse, occupied by 2 strangers trying to build something out of wreckage neither of them had chosen, but both of them, it seemed, had decided to fight for. She thought, as she finally climbed into the narrow bed in her small room off the kitchen, about Bertie Lunsford's words at the general store, "Thank me if you're still out there in a month," and about the old man's dry laugh, and about the boy who'd stared at her like she was something curious and probably temporary. She thought about how the whole town, it seemed, was waiting for her to fail, the same way they'd watched 3 women before her fail, packing up and leaving in defeat. The ranch swallowing them whole, the way it had apparently been swallowing everything in its path for 3 long years. She fell asleep thinking, with the same stubborn certainty that had carried her off that stagecoach and onto that crumbling porch, that she was not going to be the 4th woman the town watched leave. Whatever Ashmore Crossing expected of her, whatever Garrick Rowan himself might quietly expect, given how the last 2 years had taught him not to trust good things to last, she intended to prove every last one of them wrong, 1 patched roof and 1 mended fence at a time, for as long as it took. Outside, the wind moved low and dry across the broken fences and the thin, struggling cattle, carrying with it the smell of dust and the distant promise of weather that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to help or to hurt. And somewhere beneath all of it, quiet and unacknowledged, something on that ranch had already begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The second week settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke about out loud, like naming it might scare it off. Maris woke before dawn most mornings now, not because Garrick asked her to, but because lying still in that narrow bed only gave her mind room to wander toward all the ways this could still fail, and she'd rather be moving than thinking. She'd get the stove going, get something simple cooking, and by the time the sky started turning gray over the eastern hills, she was usually already out at the barn with a list in her head of everything that needed doing that day, a list that never seemed to get shorter no matter how much they crossed off it. "You ever stop?" Garrick asked her one morning, finding her already elbow-deep in the feed bins, trying to work out exactly how many more days the remaining grain would stretch if she cut the ration back another quarter. "I stop when there's nothing left to do," Maris said, not looking up from her count. "There's always something left to do here, so I suppose the answer is no." "That's not an answer. That's a way of avoiding one." She did look up at that, mildly surprised he'd pushed on it. "Fine. No, I don't stop much. Stopping gives a person time to think about how bad things look, and I found I do better work when I'm not thinking about how bad things look." Garrick considered that for a moment, leaning against the doorframe with his hat pushed back. "Eleanor used to say I thought too much, sat with a problem too long instead of just doing something about it, even if the something wasn't perfect. She sounds like she had good sense." "She did." He said it simply, without the heaviness that usually came into his voice when her name came up. More sense than me most days. It was the first time he'd spoken of his late wife without that closed, guarded look settling over his face, and Maris took it as a small sign of something shifting, though she didn't make a show of noticing. She'd learned already that Garrick Rowan was a man who'd bolt the door on a feeling the second he caught himself having it, and the surest way to keep him talking was to act like nothing he said was particularly remarkable. "Well," she said, going back to her count, "I'm not perfect either, so we should get along fine on that score. Now, tell me honestly, is there anyone in this county who owes you a favor, or who you've done a favor for, who might part with some grain or feed on credit until we can pay it back?" Garrick rubbed the back of his neck, the way he did when a question made him uncomfortable. "There's Otis Bell, runs the spread 2 ranches over. We weren't never close, but I helped him round up strays one bad winter, years back before things got hard here. You might remember it, might not. Might remember it is good enough to try," Maris said. "We'll ride out there this afternoon." "We? You don't think I'm staying behind while you go ask a man for a favor I came up with, do you?" He almost smiled, the way he did more often now, that small flicker before he caught himself. "No," he admitted. "I suppose I don't." The ride to Otis Bell's spread took the better part of 2 hours, the two of them on horseback, Maris managing the gelding Garrick had assigned her with more confidence than she actually felt, since it had been a long while since she'd ridden regularly. The land between Rowan's ranch and Bell's was much the same as everywhere else in the valley, dry, cracked, struggling, though here and there she noticed patches where the grass held a little greener, a little thicker, and she filed that observation away without comment, the way she'd been filing away dozens of small observations since she'd arrived, building up a picture in her mind of the land's quiet logic, the places where water still pooled deep enough underground to keep something alive even through drought. Otis Bell turned out to be a heavy-set man with a weathered, suspicious face that softened only slightly when he recognized Garrick riding up his lane. "Rowan," he said by way of greeting, standing on his porch with his arms crossed. "Been a long while." "Been a long while," Garrick agreed. "Otis, this is Maris Holloway. She's managing the place for me now." Otis's eyes moved to Maris with open curiosity, the same cataloging look she'd gotten used to from everyone in this county. "Heard about that. Heard you'd hired a woman. Didn't figure she'd still be around this many days in." "I'm still around," Maris said evenly, "and I'm the reason we're here, Mr. Bell, so if you've got opinions about my staying power, I'd rather you save them and let me make my case first." That seemed to catch him off guard, and after a beat, something like respect flickered across his heavy features. "All right, make your case then." She laid it out plainly. The state of the herd, the thin grass, the math that simply didn't work without supplemental feed, and the offer she'd thought through on the ride over, that they'd trade labor for grain, that Garrick and herself would help with whatever needed doing on Bell's spread, fence work, branding, whatever he was short-handed on, in exchange for enough feed to get the Rowan cattle through to when the grass came back stronger. Otis listened without interrupting, which Garrick later told her was unusual for him, and when she finished, he was quiet a long moment, looking between the two of them. "You came up with that?" he asked Maris. "I did." "Rowan," he said, turning to Garrick, "you'd be a fool not to keep her around." He spat to the side, which seemed to be his way of sealing a decision. "I can spare some grain. Not much, mind. My own stores aren't fat this year either. But I could use hands on my east fence line, and if you two are willing to put in honest work for it, I'll trade you what I can manage." The ride back was quieter than the ride out, but it was a different kind of quiet, less heavy, and Maris noticed Garrick sitting straighter in the saddle than he had in days. "You didn't think he'd say yes," she said. "I didn't think he'd say yes," Garrick admitted. "I've asked men for help before, since Eleanor died. Most of them found a reason to say no. Polite reasons, but no all the same." "Maybe you were asking the wrong way," Maris said. "Asking for charity, maybe. People say no to charity easier than they say no to a fair trade. Nobody likes feeling like they're being asked to feel sorry for someone. They'll work with you a lot faster than they'll pity you." Garrick was quiet for a stretch after that, and when he spoke again, his voice had something rougher in it than usual. "Is that what I've been doing? Asking for pity?" "I don't know," Maris said honestly. "I only just got here, but I know what it felt like in the city after my husband died when people offered help. Half of them meant it kindly, and it still felt like being handed scraps. The other half just wanted to feel good about themselves for handing me something. I learned to stop asking for help and start asking for trade. People respect a trade. A trade means you've still got something to offer, even when everything else looks like it's falling apart. He didn't answer that right away, but she saw him turning it over, the way he did most things, she said now, weighing it against whatever he already believed and deciding, slowly, whether to let it change his mind. The fence work at Bell's spread took the better part of 3 days. Hard, unglamorous labor, under a sun that didn't care how tired either of them already was. And by the time they'd finished and hauled their share of grain back to the Rowan property, both of them were sunburned and aching, and in Maris's case, nursing blisters that had finally started to harden into something closer to calluses. But the cattle ate better that week than they had in longer than Garrick could remember, and something in the animal's posture seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, the way a beaten thing shifts when it senses, for the first time in a while, that someone's looking out for it. It was around this time that Maris turned her attention fully to the fences, the project she'd flagged that first morning and set aside in favor of more urgent matters. She walked the full 3 miles of fence line over the course of a single exhausting day, a notebook in hand, an old ledger of Garrick's with most of its pages blank, since the books hadn't been kept in any real way for years, marking down every section that needed work and roughly how bad the damage was. "You're keeping records now," Garrick observed, watching her hunched over the ledger by lamplight that evening, her hand cramped from writing. "Somebody should," Maris said. "How do you know what's working and what isn't if you've got no record of where you started? I want to know 6 months from now whether what we're doing is actually helping or whether we're just running in circles feeling like we're working hard. And if it turns out we're just running in circles, then we'll know that too, and we'll try something else." She glanced up at him. "Better to know than to guess, Garrick." The fence repair itself was where her father's old lessons proved most useful, the ones she'd absorbed as a girl without realizing she was absorbing them. Watching him work a property even more hopeless than this one with even less money to throw at the problem. She showed Garrick how to salvage wire from the worst damaged sections to reinforce the sections that were only half gone, rather than buying new wire they couldn't afford. She had him split fallen deadwood from a stand of trees along the creek into usable posts instead of buying lumber, and though the posts weren't as straight or as handsome as bought ones, they held. And holding was what mattered. "This isn't how my father built fence," Garrick said at one point, eyeing a section they'd just finished, wire pulled tight between 2 slightly crooked posts. "Did your father have money to spare?" "No." "Then I doubt he'd mind us doing it different, so long as it holds." She tested the wire with a firm tug, satisfied when it didn't give. "A fence doesn't need to be pretty, Garrick. It needs to keep the cattle in and the coyotes out. Everything past that is just pride, and pride doesn't fix anything by itself." He laughed at that. A real laugh, short but genuine, the kind she hadn't heard from him yet. "You sound like my father just then. He used to say something almost exactly like that. Maybe your father and I would have gotten along." "Maybe," Garrick said, and there was something warm in the way he said it, something that hadn't been there the first day, when every word out of his mouth had carried the flat weight of a man simply enduring his own life rather than living it. Word of what was happening at the Rowan place moved through Ashmore Crossing the way word moved through any small, isolated community, slowly at first, then all at once, carried by Tobias and his feed deliveries, by Otis Bell mentioning the fence work to whoever would listen, by the simple fact that the Rowan cattle, glimpsed from the road by anyone passing, were starting to look less like ghosts and more like actual livestock. Bertie Lunsford herself rode out one afternoon, ostensibly to deliver mail that had been sitting at the store for over a week, though Maris suspected the mail was an excuse more than a genuine errand. "You're still here," Bertie said, by way of greeting, looking Maris over with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from the flat skepticism of their first meeting. "I'm still here," Maris agreed. "Tobias says the place looks different, says the cattle aren't quite so bad off as they were. They're better fed. That's most of it." Bertie's eyes drifted toward the fence line visible from where they stood, the new section standing straighter than the old, even with their mismatched, salvaged materials. "And the fence?" "We've been working it section by section. It's slow, but it holds." "Huh." Bertie seemed to chew on that a moment, like she was deciding whether to be impressed or to remain suspicious out of habit. Well, town's been saying you'd be gone by now. You and Rowan both, probably, given how things were going before you showed up. I heard, Maris said without rancor. I don't much care what the town's been saying, Mrs. Lunsford. No offense meant. I came here to do a job, and I intend to keep doing it. Something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across Bertie's tired face. None taken. Folks talk because there's not much else to do out here, and it's easier to bet against something than to bet on it. But I'll say this. She handed over the bundle of mail. You keep this up, and you might just shut a few mouths in this town that have been running for longer than they should. After Bertie left, Maris found Garrick out near the barn, watching the exchange from a distance without having approached. She came out here just to see for herself, Maris said. She did, Garrick agreed. Word travels fast in a place this small. Mostly bad word, usually, but I suppose good word travels too when there's enough of it to travel. Does it bother you, being talked about? He thought about that, leaning against the fence rail they'd repaired the day before, testing its strength absently with one hand the way he'd started doing with every section they finished, like he still didn't quite trust the work to hold. Used to, he admitted. After Eleanor died and things started falling apart, I knew what they were saying about me, that I'd given up, that I didn't have it in me to hold the place together without her. Hardest part wasn't even that they were saying it. Hardest part was knowing they were right. They're not right anymore, Maris said simply. No, Garrick said, looking out over the pasture, the mended fence, the cattle grazing with a little more flesh on their bones than they'd had 2 weeks before. I don't suppose they are. The work didn't get easier exactly, but it got more familiar, the kind of hard that a body learns to carry without it wearing quite so heavy. Maris kept her ledger faithfully, noting which sections of fence held and which needed revisiting, tracking the slow, careful increase in the cattle's condition, recording every trade and every favor called in, building a record of the ranch's recovery one entry at a time. Garrick, for his part, started doing something Maris hadn't expected. He started bringing ideas of his own to her, instead of simply following her lead. Small suggestions at first, tentative, like a man testing whether his voice still had weight after years of nobody listening to it. I've been thinking, he said one evening, over a supper of stew that had actual meat in it for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to discuss, about the south pasture, the one we haven't touched yet. What about it? There's a stretch of it that floods some, most years, even in drought, on account of how the ground sits lower than the rest. If we cleared the brush choking that section and let the grass come in proper, it might hold more moisture than the rest of the property. Might be worth more grazing than we've been getting from it. Maris set down her spoon, looking at him with something that might have been surprise, though she tried not to let too much of it show, not wanting to make a show of how much it meant to hear him offering up his own plan rather than waiting on hers. That's a good thought. Why haven't you worked that section before now? Garrick was quiet a moment, turning his own spoon over in his bowl. Didn't see the point, I suppose. Everything felt like it was just delaying the inevitable before. Didn't matter how I spent my days, since the end result was going to be the same regardless. Losing the place, one way or another. Wasn't worth the effort to think past what was right in front of me. And now? Now I don't know, he admitted. Now it feels like maybe the effort's worth something. I can't say I've got real hope. Not yet. Not the kind that doesn't flinch when I say the word out loud. But I've got something. Enough to think about the south pasture instead of just letting it sit there going to waste. That's enough, Maris said. Hope's a fragile thing anyway. Better to build something solid underneath it first, so it's got somewhere to stand when it finally shows up. They cleared the south pasture over the following week, hacking back brush and burning what couldn't be salvaged for fence posts. And true to Garrick's instinct, the ground beneath held moisture deeper than the rest of the property. The grass that grew back and coming in thicker and greener than anywhere else on the ranch. It wasn't a miracle, nothing so dramatic as that. Just a slow, steady improvement, the kind that came from two people paying close attention to a piece of land that had been ignored too long, and giving it back the attention it needed to remember how to provide for itself again. By the end of the third week, the Rowan Ranch looked like a different place than the one Maris had ridden up to on that first dusty afternoon. Not transformed, not yet, not by any means whole or healed. The house still leaned on its broken porch posts. The barn roof still had gaps they hadn't gotten to, and the debt at the bank in Calder's Ridge still loomed over everything they did, an unspoken weight neither of them mentioned often, but both of them carried regardless. But the fences stood straighter. The cattle had flesh on their bones. The south pasture grew green instead of brown. And Garrick Rowan, the quiet, broken man Maris had found standing in his barn doorway that first afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag dirtier than what he was cleaning, had started slowly, carefully, like a man relearning a language he'd once known well, to talk about the future as though it might actually arrive. One evening, sitting on the mended porch steps after the day's work was done, watching the sun go down gold and orange over hills that no longer looked quite so much like the edge of the world, Garrick spoke without looking at her, his voice low. "I didn't think anybody could turn this place around," he said. "Didn't think I could, and didn't figure anybody else would want to try hard enough to manage it either." "You're the one doing the turning," Maris said. "I'm just the one who wouldn't let you stop." "Maybe." He glanced at her sideways, something unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there before, something that looked almost like the beginning of trust. "Either way, I'm glad you didn't climb back in that wagon." "So am I," Maris said, and meant it more than she'd expected to, watching the same sunset settle over a ranch that 3 weeks ago she'd have sworn was beyond saving, and that now, against every reasonable expectation, seemed to be finding its way back towards something that might, eventually, with enough stubbornness and enough work, deserve to be called a home. The frost came early that year, a hard, unexpected snap in the last week before planting season that killed off the first tender shoots Maris had coaxed up in the kitchen garden and left both of them standing in the gray morning light, looking at wilted green stems with the particular despair of people who'd worked too hard for too little to lose anything at all without feeling it. "It's just the garden," Garrick said, though his voice carried more weight than the words let on. "Not the real planting yet. We've still got time before that." "I know what it is," Maris said, crouching to examine the damage anyway, running a thumb over a collapsed pepper plant like she might will it back upright through sheer stubbornness. "I just don't like what it might mean for what's coming." "What's coming is spring," Garrick said, "same as every year. Spring's been unkind to this valley 3 years running, by your own account. I'd rather not assume this year breaks the pattern just because we want it to." He didn't have an answer for that, and they left the garden as it was, turning their attention instead to the larger planning that mattered more. The main field, 11 acres of cleared, workable ground that represented the actual future of the ranch, the difference between scraping by and building something that could last. They'd spent the better part of 2 months preparing that field, turning soil gone hard and resentful after years of neglect, hauling what little fertilizer they could scrape together from the barn and trading for more from neighbors who'd started slowly to see the Rowan place as worth trading with rather than pitying. By the time the actual planting began, late in the season, compared to what Garrick said his father used to do, but as early as the soil would allow given how long it had taken to prepare it properly, the whole rhythm of the ranch had shifted into something that felt, to Maris, almost like momentum. Seed went into the ground a row at a time, Garrick working the lines with a focus she hadn't seen in him before, like a man remembering, with his hands and his back rather than his mind, what it felt like to do work that mattered. "You're different out here," Maris observed one afternoon, watching him check the depth of a furrow with the careful attention of someone double-checking work he genuinely cared about getting right. "Different how?" "Lighter, like the field doesn't weigh on you the way the rest of it does." Garrick straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of one dirt-streaked hand. "Eleanor used to plant a row alongside me every spring, said it was the one time of year the place felt like it had a future instead of just a present." He looked out over the half-planted field, something distant in his expression. "I haven't planted like this since she died. Just went through the motions the last few years, put seed in the ground because that's what a man does, but I didn't feel anything doing it. Felt dead, same as everything else felt dead. And now?" He was quiet a moment, considering the question with the same care he gave most things she asked him lately. "Now it feels like it might mean something again. I can't explain it better than that." "You don't have to explain it better than that," Maris said. "That's plenty." The planting finished a week later, every workable acre of the main field given over to corn and wheat and a smaller section for vegetables that would feed them through winter rather than be sold. And for a few days after, there was a strange, suspended quality to life on the ranch, the two of them existing in the gap between the work that had been done and the harvest that hadn't yet come. Watching the sky with an attention that bordered on obsessive, waiting to see what the season would decide to give them. It was Tobias who brought the first real warning, riding out one afternoon with a wagon half loaded with supplies and a look on his face that told Maris something was wrong before he'd said a single word. "Bertie sent me out," he said, climbing down from the wagon with more urgency than his usual loose, easy manner. "Said you two ought to know. There's a storm system building out past the western ridge, bigger than anything we've had through here in a few years, from what the riders coming through from Calder's Ridge are saying. Could bring real rain, a lot of it, all at once." "How much is a lot?" Garrick asked, his voice gone careful in a way Maris recognized now, the sound of a man bracing himself against a hope he didn't trust yet. "Don't know exactly, but the talk in town is it might be the kind of rain that doesn't soak in so much as it runs, on account of how hard and cracked the ground's gotten after 3 dry years. Water doesn't sink into ground like that. It just slides over the top of it and goes looking for the lowest spot it can find." Maris felt something cold settle in her stomach, doing the calculation before anyone said it out loud. "And the lowest spot on this property is the main field." Tobias nodded, looking apologetic, like he was somehow responsible for the geography of the land itself. "That's what I figured you'd want to know, ma'am. Bertie said to tell you straight, not soften it any. Said you'd want the truth plain." "She's right," Maris said. "Thank you, Tobias. Tell her we're grateful for the warning." After Tobias left, Maris and Garrick stood at the edge of the main field, looking at the rows of young green shoots pushing up through the dark soil, weeks of work and hope represented in every careful row, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "How bad could it be?" Maris finally asked. "Bad," Garrick said flatly. "The field sits in the lowest part of the property, same reason it floods some most springs, even without a big storm. If we get heavy rain all at once, especially after 3 years of ground packed so hard it won't drink water properly anymore, that field could go under. Not just damaged, drowned. Everything we planted, gone, and no time left in the season to replant before the real heat sets in and kills anything we'd try to put in the ground after. And if that happens?" He didn't answer right away, and his silence said more than words would have. Maris already knew the shape of the answer regardless. She'd seen the ledger. She'd done the math on what the bank in Calder's Ridge expected and what the ranch could currently provide toward that debt. And she understood, with the same flat clarity she applied to most hard truths, that a failed harvest this season wasn't simply a setback. It was the kind of blow that could end everything they'd spent the last 2 months rebuilding. "We'd lose the place," Garrick said finally, the words coming out rough, like they cost him something to say plainly. "Not this season. But the bank's patience runs out eventually, and a failed harvest on top of everything else, there's nothing left to show them, nothing to convince them to wait another year." "Then we don't let the field flood," Maris said. Garrick looked at her like she'd suggested something faintly absurd. "Maris, I don't know how you propose we stop rain from falling." "I'm not proposing we stop the rain. I'm proposing we give the water somewhere else to go besides on top of our crops." She was already moving, walking the edge of the field with the same intense, assessing focus she'd brought to walking the fence line weeks before, eyes tracing the slope of the land, the low points, the places where water would naturally want to gather. "My father dealt with flooding one bad spring before we lost the farm. He didn't have money for proper drainage, couldn't afford to bring in anyone with the equipment to do it right. So he dug ditches. By hand, with whoever he could get to help him, cutting channels that would carry the water away from the crops and toward ground that didn't matter as much, instead of letting it pool where it would do harm." "By hand," Garrick repeated. "Maris, do you understand what you're describing? That field is 11 acres. Cutting drainage channels deep enough and long enough to actually move that much water by hand in the time we've got before a storm hits." "I understand exactly what I'm describing," Maris said, turning to face him. "I'm describing the only option I can see that doesn't end with us watching that field drown and losing everything we've built these past 2 months. Unless you've got a better idea, in which case I'd very much like to hear it." Garrick didn't have a better idea. Neither of them said so directly, but the silence that followed confirmed it plainly enough, and after a long moment he let out a breath that seemed to carry some of the fight out of him, replaced by something more resigned and more determined at once. "All right," he said. "Show me what you're thinking." They spent the rest of that day and most of the next working out the plan, walking the field's low points and high points, sketching rough lines in the dirt with sticks, arguing more than once about where exactly the channels needed to run to do the most good with the least amount of digging. Maris remembered enough of her father's work to guide the broad strokes. But the specifics of this particular field, its particular slopes and soft spots, required the kind of close, patient observation that ate up hours they didn't feel they had to spare. "We need it cut here," Maris said, dragging her boot heel through the dirt to mark a line running along the field's eastern edge, channeling toward that gully past the fence line. "And another branch here, cutting across the middle low point, joining up with the first before it reaches the gully, so the water from both sides has somewhere to go instead of pooling in the center where most of the crop sits." Garrick studied the lines she'd drawn, walking them slowly, occasionally crouching to check the actual lay of the land against what she'd sketched. "That middle channel's going to cut clean through 6 rows of wheat. 6 rows we lose on purpose beats the whole field lost to flooding." "I know that," he said, not arguing the point so much as voicing the cost of it out loud, the way a man does when he needs to hear himself say a hard thing before he can fully accept it. "Doesn't make it easy to swallow, is all." "Nothing about this is easy to swallow," Maris said, "but we don't have time to make peace with it slowly. We need to start digging today, this afternoon, because I don't know how many days we've got before that storm arrives, and digging 11 acres worth of drainage by hand isn't something we finish in an afternoon no matter how hard we work." They started that same afternoon, breaking ground on the first channel with shovels that had seen better days. The work brutal from the very first hour, soil packed hard from years of drought, fighting back against every strike of the blade. Maris's hands, already toughened by weeks of fence work and barn repair, still blistered fresh in places the shovel handle rubbed raw, and Garrick worked beside her without complaint, though she could see the strain of it settling into his shoulders and back as the hours wore on. "We need more hands," Garrick said, late in the first day, straightening to stretch his back, surveying the modest length of channel they'd managed to cut in hours of brutal labor against the 11 acres still waiting. "Just the 2 of us, working dawn to dark. We might not finish before the storm hits." "Who would we even ask?" Maris said. "Half the county's barely scraping by themselves. Asking them to drop their own work to come dig drainage for us, when we can't pay them anything for it." "We don't need to pay them," Garrick said slowly, an idea taking shape behind his eyes. "We need to ask them the way you taught me to ask Otis Bell. Not for charity, for something that benefits them too." "What benefit is there in digging our drainage ditches?" "None, not directly," Garrick admitted. "But if this storm's as big as Tobias says, it's not just our field at risk. Half the low ground in this valley could flood, depending on how the water moves once it starts falling. If we get ahead of it, if we show people a way to protect their own ground before the rain hits instead of after the damage is already done, that's not charity we're asking for. That's warning people about a danger that threatens them too, and offering a solution they can use on their own land if they're willing to help us prove it works first." Maris considered that, slowly nodding as the logic settled into place. "You want to ride into town and tell them what we're doing and ask for help digging in exchange for showing them how to protect their own low fields?" "I want to try," Garrick said. "I don't know if anybody'll come. Folks around here have learned to keep to themselves, keep their own troubles, their own business. But if there's a chance it gets us more hands on this field before the rain comes, I think it's worth the ride." "Then go," Maris said. "I'll keep digging here. Every hour matters." Garrick rode into Ashmore Crossing as the sun started its long slide toward evening, and Maris kept working through the fading light alone, channel by slow, grueling channel, until the dark made it too dangerous to keep swinging a shovel blind. She ate a cold supper alone that night, too exhausted to properly cook, and fell asleep almost before she'd finished eating, her whole body one solid ache from collar to boots. She woke before dawn to the sound of wagons in the yard, and stumbling out onto the porch in the gray pre-morning light, she found something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't have a tidy name for. Garrick stood in the yard, talking low with a small but unmistakable gathering of people. Otis Bell, looking grim but present, 2 younger men Maris didn't recognize, and climbing down from her own wagon with a determined set to her jaw, Bertie Lunsford herself, dressed for hard outdoor work rather than storekeeping. "What is this?" Maris asked, coming down off the porch. "This," Garrick said, with something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that sounded almost like wonder, "is everybody who decided the rain coming was worth a morning's work to prepare for." Wasn't just for you, understand, Otis Bell said gruffly, though there was no real edge to it. My own east field sits low, same as yours does. Figured if Rowan's got a way to keep water moving instead of pooling, I want to see it work before I trust it on my own ground. And I came, Bertie said, because Tobias told me half this valley could flood if that storm's as bad as the writers say, and because I figured somebody ought to keep an eye on whether you two were about to dig yourselves into an early grave trying to save 11 acres by hand. She looked Maris over, that same assessing look from their first meeting, though gentler now, almost fond. Heard you were still here. Wanted to see it for myself. I'm still here, Maris said, the corner of her mouth lifting despite the exhaustion weighing on her. So I see. Bertie picked up a shovel leaning against the wagon. Well, don't stand there gawking at me, girl. Show me where you want this water to go. What followed was, in Maris's memory afterward, one of the strangest and most exhausting and most strangely beautiful stretches of work she'd ever been part of. A half-dozen people, most of them near strangers a month before, spread across the main field digging channels in the gray early light, the work brutal and unglamorous, hands blistering, backs aching, but carried along by a shared, unspoken understanding that they were racing something none of them could see yet, but all of them could feel coming. A pressure in the air. A stillness that wasn't peace so much as the held breath before a held breath finally breaks. You sure about where this channel cuts? One of the younger men asked Maris around midday, pausing to wipe sweat from his eyes, looking dubiously at the line she'd marked through a healthy stretch of corn. I'm sure, Maris said. I know it costs crop. It costs less than losing the whole field. He didn't argue further, just kept digging, and that, more than anything else, told Maris something had shifted, not just in the ranch's fortunes, but in how this small, wary community had started to see her. A month ago, a stranger telling a local man to cut through his neighbor's corn would have been laughed off the property. Now, exhausted and dirt-streaked, she was simply trusted, her judgment taken at something close to face value, earned the hard way through weeks of work that had spoken louder than any words could have. Garrick worked the line beside her most of that day, occasionally catching her eye across the field with a look that carried more than either of them said out loud, something that had been building quietly under the surface of all their shared labor these past weeks, unacknowledged but undeniable. At one point, passing close enough to speak without the others overhearing, he said, low, I don't know how to thank you for this. Any of it. You don't need to thank me, Maris said, not looking up from her digging. We're in this together now, Garrick. That's not something that needs thanking. That's just what it is. It is, he agreed, and something in the way he said it settled warm in her chest despite the grueling work, despite the exhaustion, despite the storm bearing down on them from somewhere out past the western ridge that none of them could see yet, but all of them could feel, closer with every passing hour. The work continued through that second day and into a third, the volunteers from town coming and going as their own obligations allowed, but a steady core remaining, Otis Bell proving particularly tireless, working with the grim determination of a man protecting his own future as much as Garrick's, and Bertie Lunsford surprising everyone, Maris included, by matching the younger men shovel for shovel despite her age, refusing every suggestion that she take a rest. I buried a husband on land not so different from this, she told Maris during a brief pause for water, both of them sitting on overturned buckets in whatever shade they could find. Watched a flood take his crop one bad spring years back, before I came to keep store in town instead. Didn't have anybody digging channels for us then. Just watched it happen and couldn't do a thing about it. She looked out over the half-finished network of channels cutting through the field, the dirt dark and raw against the green crop rows. This is the first time in a long while I've felt like a person could actually do something instead of just watching disaster come. You didn't have to come help, Maris said. Not really your fight. Everything in a valley this small is everybody's fight, sooner or later, Bertie said. Took me longer than it should have to remember that. Watching you not give up on this place, when everybody figured you would, reminded me some things are worth fighting for even when the odds don't favor you. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. Now quit looking at me like that. We've got more digging to do before that sky decides to open up. By the third evening, the drainage network was, if not complete, at least functional. A series of channels cutting through the lowest points of the field, joining together into a larger trunk channel that ran toward the gully past the fence line, designed to carry excess water away from the crops and out toward ground that didn't matter, where it could pool harmlessly without drowning anything that mattered to their survival. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of engineering a man with money and proper equipment would have produced. But it was solid, tested as best they could test it by hauling buckets of water from the well and pouring them at the highest points to watch how the channels carried the flow, adjusting where needed, deepening where the water moved too sluggish. The volunteers from town left that evening with promises to return if the storm proved as bad as feared, and Maris and Garrick stood alone in the field as the light faded, looking at the network of raw dirt channels cutting through their crop like scars, both of them too exhausted to feel much beyond a grim, uncertain hope. "It might not be enough," Garrick said quietly, voicing the fear neither of them had said aloud through 3 days of brutal labor. "It might not be," Maris agreed, "but it's the most we could do with what we had, and that has to be enough because there's nothing left to give it beyond what we've already given." The storm arrived 2 nights later, announced first by a wind that picked up sharp and sudden in the late afternoon, bending the crop rows flat and sending dust devils spinning across the yard, and then by a darkness that rolled in from the western ridge faster than anything Maris had seen, blotting out the last of the daylight hours before it should have naturally faded. Garrick secured the barn doors and checked every loose board with a grim, methodical thoroughness, and Maris helped where she could, both of them moving with the tight, controlled urgency of people who understood, without needing to say it, that everything they'd worked for these past 2 months was about to be tested by something neither of them could control or argue with. The first rain came just after full dark, a hard, driving rain that hammered against the house's roof loud enough to make conversation difficult, and within an hour it had escalated into something closer to a deluge. Sheets of water falling so thick that lightning flashes showed Maris through the kitchen window, a yard that had already turned to running mud, water sheeting across ground too hard and cracked to drink it in fast enough. "The field," Maris said, watching the rain through the glass with her stomach tight and cold. "Nothing we can do about it now," Garrick said, his voice carrying a tension that matched hers despite the steadiness he tried to keep in it. "Channels are cut. Either they hold the water or they don't. Going out there in this storm wouldn't change anything. It'd just get one of us hurt or worse." "I know that," Maris said. "Knowing it doesn't make it easier to sit here doing nothing while it happens." They didn't sleep that night, not really, both of them sitting up through the worst of the storm's fury, listening to the rain hammer the roof and the wind howl past the windows, occasionally rising to check that no new leaks had sprung in the barn roof they'd patched weeks before, that the horses inside were calm despite the noise outside. Around midnight, the lightning came close enough that the thunder following it shook the window panes, and Maris found herself, without entirely deciding to, gripping Garrick's arm where he sat beside her at the kitchen table, both of them watching the dark window like it might show them something useful if they only looked hard enough. "If this doesn't hold," Garrick said quietly, sometime in the deep, exhausted hours past midnight, "if the field floods anyway after everything, so—" "Don't," Maris said. "Don't talk like it's already happened. We did everything we knew how to do. Whatever happens past that point isn't a failure of effort. It's just weather, and weather doesn't care how hard 2 people worked against it." "That's easy to say." "It's not easy to say," Maris said, more sharply than she meant to, though she didn't take it back. "It's hard to say, Garrick, and I'm saying it anyway because one of us needs to keep their head clear enough to think past tonight, whatever tonight brings. If the field floods, we deal with that tomorrow. Tonight, all we can do is wait and trust the work we already put in." He didn't answer that directly, but he didn't pull his arm away from where her hand still gripped it either, and they sat together through the rest of that long, thunderous night. 2 people who'd built something fragile and uncertain out of shared labor and stubbornness, now forced simply to wait and see whether that fragile thing would survive the test it was facing. The rain finally began to slacken sometime past 3 in the morning, the worst of the storm's fury spending itself against the valley before moving on, though a steady, softer rain continued through what remained of the night and into the gray, exhausted dawn. Neither of them had slept more than fitfully, and as the first real light began to show through the rain-streaked windows, both of them rose without needing to say anything, pulling on boots and coats and heading out into the wet, muddy yard to see what the storm had left behind. The walk to the main field felt longer than it ever had before, both of them silent, neither willing to voice the fear sitting heavy between them, and when they finally crested the low rise that gave view of the whole field, Maris felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, wet morning air. Water stood in the field, more water than she'd hoped to see, pooling in low patches between the crop rows. But it wasn't standing still, drowning everything in its path the way it would have without intervention. It was moving, sluggish but steady, channeled along the lines they'd cut 3 days before, flowing toward the trunk channel and out, finally, toward the gully past the fence line, where it pooled harmlessly against ground that had never mattered to their survival in the first place. The crop rows themselves stood bent and battered by the storm's wind and rain, leaves stripped in places, stems flattened where the worst of the water had passed close by. But they stood. Drowned, ruined plants would have looked different, blackened, waterlogged, beyond saving. What Maris saw instead, walking closer with her heart hammering against her ribs, was crop that had taken a beating and survived it. Roots still anchored in soil that had drained rather than flooded, thanks to the channels that had done exactly what she'd hoped they would do. "Garrick," she said, her voice catching. He was already moving faster than her, half running down the rise toward the field's edge, crouching at the line of one of the channels to watch the water moving through it, steady and controlled, exactly as they'd designed it to move. "It held," he said, and his voice broke on the words in a way Maris had never heard from him. 3 months of grief and exhaustion and stubborn, quiet hope, all colliding at once in 2 simple words. "Maris, it held." She came up beside him, crouching at the edge of the same channel, watching the muddy water flow past exactly where they'd cut it to flow, carrying away what would have drowned them otherwise. And something in her own chest broke open too, relief so sharp it felt almost like pain. "It held," she repeated, and then, because there wasn't anything else adequate to say, because 3 days of brutal digging and 1 long, terrified night of waiting had finally resolved into something that looked, against every reasonable expectation, like success, she laughed. A startled, disbelieving laugh that came out half-sob, and Garrick laughed too, the sound of it rough and unfamiliar from a man who'd forgotten, until recently, how laughter felt in his own chest. They walked the full length of the field together in the gray, rain-softened morning light, checking every channel, finding here and there sections that had overflowed slightly, a few rows of crop lost to standing water that hadn't drained quite fast enough, but nothing close to the devastation that would have come without the channels at all. The losses were real, but survivable. A fraction of the harvest, not the whole of it, the difference between a setback and a catastrophe. "We need to check the others," Garrick said, some of the urgency returning to his voice as the relief settled and practical concerns reasserted themselves. "Otis's east field. Bertie said her sister's place sits low too. If our channels held, theirs might need the same kind of help. And if the rain's done worse damage elsewhere." "Then we go," Maris said. "Right now, before we even eat, before we even change out of these wet clothes. If there's a chance to help somebody else avoid what we almost didn't avoid ourselves, that matters more than dry clothes." They rode out within the hour, exhausted and soaked and running on nothing but the strange, fierce energy that came from having survived something that had genuinely threatened to end everything, and what they found at Otis Bell's spread confirmed both the danger and the value of what they'd built. His own low field had flooded badly in places where he hadn't had time or labor enough to dig proper channels, crop lost to standing water that pooled and stayed pooled with nowhere to drain, but the sections where he'd copied their design, rough channels cut in haste based on what he'd watched them build, had fared far better, water moving through rather than gathering. "Lost maybe a third of that low section," Otis said grimly, surveying the damage with Garrick and Maris beside him. "Would have lost the whole of it without what you two showed us. I owe you for that, Rowan. Owe you both." "You don't owe us anything," Maris said. "We were trying to save our own crop. If what we figured out helped you save some of yours too, that's just good fortune all around, not a debt." "Maybe," Otis said, though his tone suggested he didn't fully agree. "But I won't forget it regardless." He looked at the two of them, weather-beaten and exhausted, mud-streaked from the work and the ride, and something in his weathered face shifted into an expression that looked unmistakably like respect freely given rather than grudgingly extended. Whole Valley's going to hear about what you two did out there. Already half of them are talking about it after watching that storm and wondering how bad the damage was going to be. You proved something this week, the both of you. Proved a body doesn't have to just sit and watch disaster come. Can fight it if they're willing to work hard enough and think clear enough. Riding back toward their own ranch later that afternoon, both of them quiet with exhaustion but carrying something lighter than exhaustion too. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the early shape of pride. Garrick spoke without looking over at her, his eyes fixed on the muddy road ahead. 3 months ago, he said, I was a man waiting to lose everything, too tired and too broken to do much besides wait for the end to finally arrive. I didn't think there was a version of this where I came out the other side of a storm like that one and felt anything besides relief that the worst had finally happened and was finally over. And now? Now I feel like maybe the worst already happened a while back, before you ever got here, and what we just survived was proof that we're past it. Not all the way past it. Bank still wants its money. Place still needs more work than either of us has hands enough to manage some days. But that storm should have ended us, Maris. By every reasonable measure, a flood like that, hitting a field we'd worked that hard to plant, should have been the thing that finished what 3 years of drought started. And it didn't, because you didn't let it. We didn't let it, Maris corrected. I had an idea. You're the one who rode into town and convinced half a dozen tired, skeptical people to spend 3 days digging ditches on a stranger's say-so. That took something I couldn't have managed alone, Garrick. Don't sell short what you did just because the idea started with me. He was quiet a moment, considering that, and then he reached over without quite seeming to decide to do it, and took her hand where it rested on the saddle, his grip rough and calloused and warm despite the cold, wet ride. Together then, he said. Together. Maris agreed, and they rode the rest of the way back to the ranch in a silence that carried more warmth in it than words could have managed. The storm behind them, the field surviving against every fair expectation, and something quietly, unmistakably shifting between the two of them that neither one was ready yet to name out loud, but that both of them, in their own separate, careful ways, had already begun to understand was no longer simply about saving a ranch. The weeks following the storm settled into something Maris hadn't quite let herself hope for, back when she'd first climbed off that stagecoach. A kind of steady, unspectacular progress that didn't announce itself with any single dramatic moment, but simply accumulated day by day into a ranch that looked less and less like the wreck she'd first seen and more like a place where two people were actually winning the fight they'd taken on. The damaged rows in the main field, the ones lost to standing water that hadn't drained quite fast enough, got replanted with a late variety of beans Otis Bell had recommended, quick growing enough to still produce something before the season turned. And the rest of the field, battered but alive, began its slow recovery, stalks straightening back up over the following weeks. Leaves unfurling green and healthy in a way that still struck Maris every time she walked the rows, as something close to miraculous given what that field had survived. You keep looking at it like you expect it to disappear, Garrick said one morning, finding her standing at the field's edge before the day's work had properly started, just watching the wheat move in a light morning wind. I keep looking at it because 3 weeks ago I wasn't sure it would still be standing, Maris admitted. Old habits. I'll stop eventually, once I trust it's actually going to hold. You don't trust things easy, do you? I trust things that have proven themselves, Maris said. This field's getting close. Give it another few weeks. Garrick studied her for a moment with an expression she'd come to recognize over these past months. Thoughtful, careful, the look of a man turning something over in his mind before deciding whether to say it out loud. Is that how you decide who to trust too? Wait for them to prove themselves? More or less. And have I? He asked, and there was something underneath the casual way he asked it, something that told her the question mattered more than his tone let on. Maris turned to look at him properly, taking in the man standing beside her, sun-darkened now from months of real work, leaner but stronger than the broken figure she'd first met in that barn doorway, eyes that no longer carried the flat, defeated look they'd had that first afternoon. You proved yourself the night you rode into town and convinced half a dozen tired strangers to dig ditches on my say-so, she said. And you've kept proving it every day since. So yes, Garrick, I trust you. Something passed over his face at that. Relief, maybe, or something warmer than relief. And he didn't say anything further, just nodded once, like he was filing the answer away somewhere it mattered to him, and the two of them went back to work without needing to fill the silence with more words than that. It was around this time that the matter of the bank came to a head, the way Maris had known it eventually would, no matter how much progress they'd made on the land itself. The notice arrived by way of Tobias, who delivered it along with the regular feed order with the apologetic, uncomfortable look of a man forced into the role of messenger for news he didn't want to carry. "Bank sent this out with the rest of the mail," he said, handing over an envelope with the Calder's Ridge Trust and loan seal pressed into the wax. "Didn't open it, ma'am. That's not my business. But the fella at the bank counter said it was important enough they wanted it delivered quick rather than waiting on the regular post." Garrick took the envelope with the particular stillness Maris had learned meant he was bracing for bad news before he'd even confirmed there was bad news to brace for. He read it standing right there in the yard, and Maris watched his jaw tighten progressively as his eyes moved down the page. "What does it say?" she asked, once Tobias had unloaded the feed and ridden off, leaving the two of them alone with whatever the letter contained. "They're calling the loan due in full come autumn," Garrick said, his voice gone flat, in the particular way it went when he was working hard to keep something larger from showing through. "Says here they've reviewed my account and determined the terms of extension granted last year were conditional on showing meaningful improvement in the property's productive capacity. Says if that improvement isn't evident by the time they send their assessor out, they'll need full payment or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings. When does the assessor come?" 6 weeks. He folded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. 6 weeks to prove a ranch that was half dead 3 years running is suddenly worth their continued patience. Maris took the letter from him and read it herself, twice, parsing through the formal, careful language banks used to dress up threats as procedure. It says meaningful improvement in productive capacity, not a specific number, not a specific repayment amount, just improvement they can see for themselves. "That's exactly the problem," Garrick said, some of the old hopelessness creeping back into his voice in a way that worried her more than the letter itself did. "What looks like improvement to us might not look like enough to a man from a bank in Calder's Ridge who's never set foot on this property and doesn't care to understand what 3 years of drought does to a place before it starts coming back. He'll see a half-finished fence line and thin cattle that aren't quite as thin as they used to be, and he'll make his decision based on numbers in a ledger that don't capture any of what we've actually built here." "Then we make sure the numbers in the ledger do capture it," Maris said, and there was something steady and immediate in her response that pulled Garrick's attention back to her, away from the spiral of doubt he'd clearly started falling into. "You have my ledger. Every repair, every trade, every improvement, dated and recorded since the day I arrived. We have the harvest coming in, which, storm or no storm, is going to be the best this ranch has produced in years by your own account. We have cattle that have visibly fattened. We have fence that stands instead of falling down. That's not nothing, Garrick. That's exactly the kind of meaningful improvement that letter is asking to see. You think that'll be enough?" "I think it has to be enough," Maris said, "because there's no version of the next 6 weeks where we don't keep doing exactly what we've already been doing. So instead of spending those 6 weeks afraid of what the assessor might decide, let's spend them making sure there's nothing left to doubt by the time he arrives." It was, Maris reflected later, the first time she'd seen real fear in Garrick, since those early days when he'd talked about the bank's debt with the flat resignation of a man who'd already accepted defeat. The fear hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but something in the way he straightened his shoulders after she spoke told her he'd decided, again, the way he seemed to keep deciding every time hardship reared up in front of them, to fight rather than simply absorb the blow. The 6 weeks that followed were, in their way, harder than the storm had been. Not because any single day demanded the same desperate all-night intensity, but because the pressure of the deadline sat over everything they did, a constant, low hum of urgency that never quite let either of them fully relax. They finished the remaining fence repairs, every section of the 3 miles now standing solid, where 4 months before, a third of it had been rotted through or simply gone. They cleared a second pasture beyond the south field, following the same instinct Garrick had shown about moisture retention, and it too came back greener than expected. The cattle, fed properly through the season, put on weight steadily enough that even Otis Bell, riding out one afternoon to check on how their drainage channels had held since the storm, remarked on it without prompting. "Don't recognize half these animals," he said, leaning on the fence rail and watching the herd graze. 3 months back, I'd have said you were better off selling the lot for whatever the slaughterhouse would give you and starting fresh. Now, look at them. They just needed feeding properly, Maris said, and grass that could actually grow instead of just surviving. Easy to say. Harder to do the way you two went about it. Otis spat to the side, his version of a compliment apparently requiring some physical punctuation. Heard the bank's leaning on you. Tobias mentioned it. Didn't mean to gossip, just worried, I think. Garrick's jaw tightened slightly, though he didn't deny it. 6 weeks to show meaningful improvement, or they called a loan. Huh. Otis considered that, scratching at his weathered jaw. You want? I could write a letter. Tell them what I've seen with my own eyes. Bankmen trust other ranchers' word sometimes, more than they trust a man pleading his own case. Carries different weight, coming from somebody with nothing to gain by lying. You do that? Garrick asked, something careful and surprised in his voice. Already said I would, didn't I? Otis said, gruff in the way that meant he didn't want to be thanked too much for it. You helped my Eastfield survive that storm. Least I can do is put ink to paper saying what I've watched happen out here these past months. Birdie'll probably do the same, if you ask her. Half the valley's been watching this place turn around. Wouldn't hurt to have a few honest voices saying so, alongside whatever the assessor sees with his own eyes. The letters came in time, Otis Bell's gruff, plainly worded account of the drainage work and its success, Bertie Lunsford's more detailed observations of the ranch's steady transformation over the months she'd watched it unfold. Even a brief note from Tobias's own father, who ran a smaller spread north of town and had traded grain with them twice over the season, attesting to the Rowan Ranch's improved standing and its reliability as a trading partner. Maris gathered them alongside her own meticulous ledger, building a case as thorough and undeniable as she knew how to make it, and if the work of assembling it all kept her up late some nights by lamplight, copying figures and organizing dates, it felt, at least, like work with a clear and worthwhile purpose. It was during one of those late nights, Garrick finding her still at the kitchen table well past when either of them usually turned in, that something shifted between them that neither had quite been ready to name before. You should sleep, he said, standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, hair mussed from a restless attempt at rest he'd apparently abandoned. I will. I just want to finish organizing this section before I lose my place. He came and sat across from her instead of heading back to bed, watching her work for a few quiet minutes before speaking again. I keep thinking about something you said back when you first got here, about not believing in curses. Just drought and bad luck and bad management, all of it fixable by somebody willing to do the work. I remember saying something like that. I didn't believe you. Not really. Not then, Garrick admitted. I'd convinced myself this place really was cursed somehow, that nothing I did was going to matter, because some things just go bad and stay bad no matter what a person tries. Eleanor dying. The sickness that took the herd, the drought, it all felt connected, like one long punishment I didn't fully understand and couldn't escape. And now? Now I think maybe I was just a man too tired and too sad to see what was actually fixable, because grief makes everything look the same shade of hopeless, whether it's a fence that needs mending or a wife who isn't coming back. He said it carefully, like the words cost him something, but his voice didn't break the way it might have months before. You walked in here and looked at the exact same mess I'd been looking at for 2 years, and you saw work that could be done instead of a curse that couldn't be lifted. I don't know how to thank somebody for showing them that, Maris. Don't know if thank you even covers it. Maris set down her pen, looking at him properly across the lamplit table. You don't owe me thanks for that, Garrick. I didn't fix anything in you. I just refused to leave before you had the chance to fix it yourself. That's not nothing. No, she agreed softly. I suppose it isn't. They sat in a silence that stretched longer than either of them seemed inclined to break, something unspoken filling the space between them, the way it had been filling the spaces between them for weeks now. In small moments neither had acknowledged outright. A hand lingering a beat too long, passing a tool. A look held a moment past what plain partnership required. The easy comfort of two people who'd built something difficult together and found, somewhere in the difficulty, an understanding that went beyond the practical arrangement that had first brought them together. Maris, Garrick said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Yes? I'm not good at this. Saying things plain, I mean. Eleanor used to say I'd rather build a man a barn than tell him I cared about him, and she wasn't wrong about that. He looked down at his hands on the table, then back up at her. But I think you know what I'm trying to say regardless, even if I can't say it as plain as you'd probably like. Maris felt something warm and careful settle in her chest. The same feeling she'd been pushing gently aside for weeks now, telling herself it wasn't yet the time, that there was still too much uncertain in their future for either of them to lean into something that fragile. I think I do know, she said, and I think, if you're asking whether I feel something close to the same thing, the answer is yes, Garrick, I do. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding, something close to a laugh, disbelieving and relieved at once. I wasn't sure how you'd take it. Wasn't sure it was fair of me to even bring it up, given you came here for work, not for... He gestured vaguely, like the right word wasn't coming. For this? Maris finished. I know. I didn't come here looking for this either, but I've found since arriving that plenty of things I didn't come looking for turned out to be worth finding anyway. She reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture simple but deliberate. We don't have to decide what this means right now, tonight, with the bank breathing down our necks and a harvest still coming in. But I wanted you to know, you're not imagining it. Whatever's grown between us these past months, it's real, on my end at least. On mine too, Garrick said, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles against the back of her hand. Has been for longer than I probably should admit. They didn't say much more than that night, both of them too aware of everything still unresolved hanging over their future to let the moment turn into something larger than it needed to be yet. But something had shifted regardless, settled into place in a way that made the remaining weeks of waiting for the bank's assessor feel, despite the underlying tension, somehow lighter to carry. The harvest itself, when it finally came, exceeded even Garrick's cautious hopes. The main field, despite the rows lost to flooding and the late replanting of beans to cover the gap, produced more wheat and corn than the ranch had seen in 3 full years. The soil's slow recovery and the careful tending Maris had insisted on finally paying out in bushels that filled the barn loft higher than Garrick said he'd seen it filled since before his father died. The cattle, fattened and healthy, fetched a better price at the autumn sale in Calder's Ridge than Garrick had dared to hope for. The buyers there remarking openly on how much better conditioned the roan herd looked compared to the gaunt, struggling animals they remembered from previous seasons. You should have seen the look on Henshaw's face, Garrick said, returning from the cattle sale with something Maris hadn't seen on him before. Genuine, unguarded pride, the kind that came from a man who'd proven something to people who'd doubted him for years. Man's run that buying operation in Calder's Ridge for a decade, seen every ranch in this county come through good years and bad. He looked at our herd and asked me straight out what I'd changed, because he said he hadn't seen improvement like that out of a Rowan property since my father's day. What did you tell him? Told him the truth, Garrick said. Told him I hired a woman who refused to accept the place was beyond saving, and she proved to be right. He smiled, and it was a real smile. Easy and unguarded in a way that still sometimes caught Maris off guard, remembering the closed, exhausted man she'd first met. He didn't quite know what to make of that, asked if you were available to consult on his own operation. I told him no. You were spoken for. Spoken for, Maris repeated, raising an eyebrow. Employed, Garrick corrected, though there was a teasing warmth underneath it that suggested he'd chosen the first word on purpose. Among other things, the bank's assessor arrived on the appointed day, a precise, unsmiling man named Whitfield who rode out from Calder's Ridge with the particular efficient coldness of someone whose job required him to evaluate other people's livelihoods without letting sentiment cloud his arithmetic. He walked the property with a notebook of his own, much like Maris's ledger, though far less personal in its purpose, marking down observations about fence condition, livestock numbers, field productivity, and the general state of the buildings, asking sharp, specific questions that Garrick and Maris answered together, presenting the letters from Otis Bell and Bertie Lunsford and the others without making a show of it, letting the documentation speak for itself. This is considerably more organized than I expected, Whitfield admitted at one point, flipping through Maris's ledger with something close to surprise crossing his otherwise unreadable face. Most properties I assess in this condition couldn't tell me what improvements they'd made if their loan depended on it. No pun intended. Every improvement's dated, Maris said, Every trade, every repair, every change in livestock condition. We wanted there to be no question about what's been done here these past months. Whitfield studied her for a moment longer than the question strictly required, something assessing in his look that had nothing to do with fences or cattle. You kept these records yourself? I did. Unusual, he said, for a property manager. But he didn't elaborate further on what he meant by that, simply made a note in his own book and moved on to his next question, and Maris couldn't tell, watching his closed professional expression, whether the unusual nature of it counted in their favor or against it. The wait for the bank's official decision stretched another agonizing 2 weeks beyond the assessment itself, during which Garrick alternated between cautious optimism and the old familiar dread that Maris had watched recede over the months, but never fully disappear. She understood it, even as she worked to talk him through it. A man who'd lost as much as Garrick had lost didn't simply unlearn the habit of bracing for the next blow, even when the evidence in front of him suggested things had genuinely changed. What if it isn't enough? He said one evening, the question arriving without preamble while they sat on the mended porch steps watching the sun go down over hills that had, by autumn, gone from drought brown to something closer to the rich gold of a season that had actually produced something worth harvesting. Then we'll deal with whatever comes next, Maris said. But Garrick, look at what's actually true right now, not what you're afraid might be true. The fences stand. The herd's fat and healthy. The harvest filled the loft higher than it's been in years, by your own account. We have letters from 3 respected people in this county testifying to exactly that. If a bank looks at all of that, plainly documented, and decides it still isn't enough, then no amount of worry on your part tonight changes that outcome. So there's no use spending tonight afraid of something you can't control, when everything you could control you already did, as well as it could be done. He was quiet a moment, watching the sunset with an expression that had softened, slowly, over their months together, from the flat, defeated look of their first meeting into something that still carried weariness but no longer carried defeat alongside it. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, Maris said, but it is, I think, true. We did everything we could. The rest isn't ours to decide. The letter arrived 11 days later, and Tobias delivered it with none of the apologetic hesitation he'd carried the first time, instead grinning broadly as he handed it over, having apparently heard something from the bank counter clerk in Calder's Ridge that he wasn't supposed to share but couldn't help hinting at. I think you're going to want to open that right quick, ma'am, he said. Mr. Rowan, too. Garrick's hands weren't quite steady as he broke the seal, and Maris stood close beside him, reading over his shoulder as his eyes moved down the page, watching his expression shift from braced tension into something that cracked open, slowly, into disbelief and then relief so profound it looked almost like pain crossing his weathered features. They're extending the terms, he said, his voice thick. Not just extending, they're refinancing the loan at better terms than the original, on account of— He had to stop, clear his throat, start again. On account of demonstrated improvement in productive capacity and management practices that, in their words, suggest a property with a sustainable path toward full repayment within the new terms. They're keeping us, Maris said, the reality of it settling slowly, the months of work and worry finally finding somewhere solid to land. They're keeping us, Garrick confirmed, and then, without quite seeming to decide to do it, he pulled her into an embrace right there in the yard, in front of Tobias, who had the good sense to look elsewhere and busy himself with his wagon, laughing in a way that came from somewhere deep and long buried, relief and joy, tangled together in a sound Maris suspected the ranch hadn't heard from him in years. We did it, he said into her hair, his voice rough. We did, Maris agreed, holding on to him just as tightly, feeling the months of grueling, uncertain work finally resolve into something that felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach, genuinely, solidly secure. Word of the bank's decision spread through Ashmore Crossing the way most news did, quickly and with considerable embellishment by the time it reached its furthest corners. But the core of it remained intact regardless of the telling. The Rowan Ranch, once considered the valley's most likely failure, had not only survived, but had impressed the bank enough to earn better terms than it had ever held before. Bertie Lunsford rode out personally to confirm the news, arriving with a bottle of something stronger than her usual offerings, and an expression that mixed satisfaction with something almost like vindication. Told you I'd thank you if you were still out here in a month, she said, setting the bottle down on the kitchen table with a decisive thump. Didn't figure I'd be congratulating you on saving the whole operation from the bank besides. Figured I'd bring something worth celebrating with, given the occasion. We couldn't have done it without the help this valley gave us, Maris said. Your letter included. My letter just told the truth, Bertie said, waving off the credit with brisk practicality, though something pleased flickered beneath her gruff exterior. Whole town's been watching this place turn around for months now, Maris. You earned every bit of what's happened here. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, including yourself, because I expect you're the type to credit everyone else before you credit your own stubbornness. Garrick laughed at that, pouring out 3 glasses of whatever Bertie had brought. She is exactly that type. Figured as much, Bertie said. Well, drink up, the both of you. You've earned it, however many people you want to share the credit with. She raised her own glass. To Ashmore Crossing's most stubborn ranch, and the woman too stubborn to let it die. To stubbornness, Garrick agreed, raising his own glass and catching Maris's eye across the table with a warmth that had nothing to do with the drink and everything to do with everything they'd built together since that first dusty afternoon when she'd climbed down from a wagon and refused to be the 4th woman this ranch chased away. Outside, beyond the mended fences and the barn with its fully patched roof, the harvested fields stretched gold and full under an autumn sky that, for the first time in years, didn't carry the threat of drought or storm, just the quiet, settled promise of a season's hard work. Finally come to rest, and somewhere in that promise, unspoken but understood by everyone gathered in that kitchen, was the knowledge that whatever the Rowan Ranch had been before Maris Holloway arrived, it would never again be mistaken for a place where hope had already died. Winter came gentler that year than either of them expected, the kind of season that settled over the valley like it had finally decided Ashmore Crossing had suffered enough and could be allowed a quiet stretch to catch its breath. The snow, when it fell soft and steady instead of the punishing drifts that had buried fence lines in years past, and Garrick spent more evenings than he probably needed to standing at the window watching it come down, like a man relearning what it felt like to watch weather without dread sitting underneath the watching. You keep looking at that snow like it owes you an apology, Maris said one evening, finding him there after she'd banked the stove for the night. Maybe it does, Garrick said, though there was no real bitterness in it anymore, just the dry humor that had crept into him over the months, replacing the flatness that used to live in its place. 3 years of drought, then a storm that nearly drowned us, and now it wants to be gentle. Land's got a strange sense of timing. Land doesn't have a sense of anything, Maris said, coming to stand beside him. It just is what it is. We're the ones who decide what to make of it. That sounds like something you'd write in that ledger of yours. Maybe I will, she said, and he laughed, low and easy, and pulled her against his side without needing to say anything further about it. The two of them watching the snow fall over a ranch that had, against every reasonable expectation anyone in that valley had held back in the spring, made it through to a winter worth watching. The refinanced loan terms gave them breathing room they hadn't had in years, room enough that Garrick started talking, cautiously at first and then with growing confidence, about plans that extended past simple survival. He mentioned, one night over supper, an idea he'd been turning over about expanding the herd come spring, using some of the harvest profits to buy a handful of healthy breeding stock rather than simply replacing what they'd lost. You think we can afford that? Maris asked, though she was already reaching for her ledger out of habit, ready to run the numbers properly instead of guessing. I think we can afford to try, Garrick said. Slow, careful, not betting everything on it the way the old me might have, desperate to fix things fast. Just steady growth, the way you taught me to think about most things now. I didn't teach you that, Maris said, though she was smiling as she said it. You had it in you all along. You just needed a reason to remember it. Maybe, he allowed. Either way, I wouldn't have remembered it without you standing in my kitchen telling me beans 3 nights running wasn't a proper supper. It certainly wasn't, Maris said, and the warmth between them in moments like that had become so woven into the ordinary fabric of their days that Maris sometimes forgot, briefly, how new all of it actually was. How short a time had passed since she'd been a stranger, climbing down from a dusty wagon onto a porch that couldn't hold its own roof up straight. It was Bertie Lunsford, of all people, who finally said out loud what half the valley had apparently been speculating about for weeks, cornering Maris during a trip into town for supplies with the particular bluntness that had become, Over the months, less an irritation and more something Maris had grown almost fond of. "You two going to make it official, or are you just going to keep on like this indefinitely?" Bertie said, ringing up a sack of flour without looking up, like the question wasn't nearly as direct as it actually was. "Make what official?" Maris asked, though she knew exactly what Bertie meant and felt heat rising in her face regardless. "Don't play coy with me, girl. Whole town's seen how that man looks at you, seen how you look right back, for that matter. I'm not asking out of nosiness, though I won't pretend I'm not curious. I'm asking because a woman my age has buried enough people and watched enough chances slip by unclaimed to know, better than most, that life doesn't hand out second chances on a regular schedule. You two found something good out of something that started as plain hard necessity. Doesn't seem the kind of thing a person ought to leave sitting unclaimed too long in case the world decides to take it back before you've had the sense to claim it properly." Maris didn't have a ready answer for that. Not because she disagreed, but because she hadn't quite let herself sit with the question in those exact terms. Busy as she'd been with harvests and ledgers and storms and bank assessors, all the practical machinery of survival that had occupied nearly every waking hour since she'd arrived. But riding back to the ranch that afternoon, Bertie's words settled into her chest and stayed there, turning over slowly, refusing to be set aside the way most passing comments usually were. She found Garrick in the barn that evening, working by lamplight on a piece of harness that had worn through, his hands moving with the steady competence that had returned to him over the months, no longer the shaking, exhausted gestures of a man simply going through motions to survive another day. "Bertie asked me something today," Maris said, leaning against the stall door. "Bertie asks everybody something most days," Garrick said, not looking up from his work. "Woman's never met a piece of business that wasn't hers to weigh in on. She asked if we were going to make this official, whatever this is." That got his attention. He set down the harness slowly, looking at her with an expression that mixed careful hope with the particular wariness of a man who'd learned, the hard way, not to trust good things until they'd proven solid enough to lean on without breaking. "And what'd you tell her?" "I didn't tell her anything," Maris admitted. "I didn't have an answer ready. I've been so busy keeping this place alive, keeping us alive, that I hadn't sat down and asked myself the question plainly." She crossed the barn floor, stopping close enough that he had to tilt his head up slightly to keep looking at her. "But I'm asking it now, Garrick. What is this to you? Not the careful version you give Bertie or Otis or anybody else in town. The plain truth." He was quiet a long moment, and Maris watched him gather himself the way he did before anything that mattered to him. The same careful deliberation he'd brought to every hard decision they'd faced together since that first dusty afternoon. "It's not what I expected when I posted that notice," he said finally. "I'll tell you that plain. I was looking for somebody to manage a dying property because I didn't have the strength left in me to manage it myself. And I figured, if I'm honest, that whoever answered would last a month at most before the place broke them, same as it broke the others. I wasn't looking for anything past that. Didn't think I had room left in me for anything past that. Not after Eleanor." He reached out, took her hand in both of his, rough and calloused and warm. "But you walked into my barn that first afternoon and looked at the worst mess I'd ever let a piece of land become. And instead of seeing a reason to leave, you saw a reason to stay and fight it. And somewhere between that first afternoon and now, Maris, you became the reason I started fighting again too. Not just for the ranch, for myself. For something that looked like a future instead of just an ending I was waiting on." "That's not an answer to what this is," Maris said softly, though her voice had gone unsteady. "I'm getting to the answer," Garrick said. "Give a slow man time to say a hard thing properly." He took a breath, steadying himself. "What this is, Maris, is the best thing that's happened to me since I buried my wife and figured nothing good was ever going to find its way back to this property again. What this is a woman I'd be a fool to let walk away from, whether she's managing my ranch or not, whether the bank's satisfied or not, whether the harvest comes in good or bad. I don't want this to just be the arrangement that saved the ranch. I want it to be the start of something that lasts a great deal longer than that." "Garrick, I'm not finished," he said, and there was something in his voice now that made her go still, watching him reach into his coat pocket with hands that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually shook. "I went into Calder's Ridge last week when I told you I was checking on cattle prices. That wasn't the whole truth. I also stopped at the jeweler there, and I've been carrying this around for 4 days trying to find the nerve to do this properly, instead of just blurting it out in a barn smelling of harness oil and horse. He opened his palm to reveal a simple ring, plain gold without much ornamentation, the kind a careful man bought when he had limited means but wanted to choose something real rather than flashy. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic. "Bank's got most of what we earn tied up in the new terms, and what's left I figured was better spent on breeding stock than something extravagant. But I wanted you to have something, regardless, something that says plainly what I haven't found the words to say plainly until just now. Maris Holloway, I'm asking you to marry me. Not because the ranch needs managing, though it does, and not because it'd be convenient, though it would be. I'm asking because I love you, plain and simple, and because I can't picture a version of my future anymore that doesn't have you standing in it." Maris felt tears she hadn't expected gathering at the corners of her eyes, the culmination of months of grief and hard labor and slow, careful rebuilding, of land and trust, and her own battered sense of what her life might still hold, all arriving at once in this small, lamplit barn that smelled of horse and harness oil and hard work. "Yes," she said, before he'd even fully lowered his hand, the word coming out simple and certain in the same way most of her decisions came out, once she'd actually let herself arrive at them. "Yes, Garrick, I'll marry you." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. Relief and joy tangled together, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had finally steadied. And then he kissed her, there in the barn, surrounded by the ordinary, unglamorous evidence of everything they'd built together. Mended harness, patched stalls, healthy livestock breathing steady in the dark beyond the lamplight. And Maris thought, in the brief moment her mind still had room for thought at all, that she had never in her life felt so completely, solidly certain of anything as she felt certain of this. They married in early spring, in a ceremony that was, by any city standard, almost laughably modest, held in the yard outside the house rather than any church, since Ashmore Crossings Church had been without a proper preacher for longer than anyone could quite remember, and the traveling minister who served the circuit wasn't due through for another month, a delay neither of them had any patience to wait out. Bertie Lunsford officiated instead, having once, decades before, held some informal authority to perform such ceremonies in a frontier town too small and too far from anywhere to always wait on proper clergy, and she took to the role with the same brisk, no-nonsense energy she brought to everything else. "Never thought I'd be doing this again," she said, standing before them with a worn book of ceremonies that had clearly seen better decades. "But I suppose there's something fitting about it, given how this whole thing started with me telling you that you wouldn't last a month out there." "I remember," Maris said, smiling. "Well, you proved me wrong, and I find I don't mind being wrong about a thing like this." Bertie cleared her throat, suddenly more sentimental than her usual gruff manner allowed for, and began the simple ceremony, the handful of witnesses gathered in the yard. Otis Bell, looking uncharacteristically emotional for a man who usually communicated mostly through spitting and grunts. Tobias, grinning broadly the entire time. A scattering of other neighbors who'd come to know the Rowan Ranch's story over the past year and wanted, it seemed, to be present for its happy conclusion. The vows themselves were simple, unadorned by anything beyond plain truth, and when Garrick spoke his voice carried steady and clear across the yard in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the broken man Maris had first met standing in a barn doorway, wiping his hands on a rag dirtier than what he was cleaning. "I promise to keep building," he said, departing slightly from whatever traditional wording Bertie's worn book provided. "The way you taught me, a person can keep building even when everything looks finished. I promise to trade fair and work honest and never again let myself sink so deep into grief that I forget the people standing right in front of me, willing to help carry the weight if I'd only let them." Maris's own vows carried less polish and more plain feeling, her voice catching once before she steadied it. "I promise to keep refusing to give up," she said, "the same way I refused to climb back into that wagon the first afternoon I saw this place. I promise to keep believing that hard work and stubbornness can fix more than people expect, and to spend that belief building something with you instead of just surviving alongside you." They were pronounced married under a sky that had, for the first time in longer than the valley's collective memory cared to admit, actually produced enough spring rain to be called generous rather than threatening, and the small gathering of neighbors who'd watched this ranch's transformation unfold over the past year cheered with a warmth that felt to Maris like the final confirmation of everything she'd hoped might be possible when she'd first answered that strange notice in a city paper that already felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. The following months brought their own ordinary challenges, the kind that came with any working ranch rather than the kind that threatened its very survival. And there was something almost luxurious, Maris found, in facing problems that were merely difficult rather than existential. A late frost threatened the new planting but didn't destroy it. One of the new breeding cattle Garrick had purchased came down with a minor illness that required careful nursing but recovered fully within a week. The barn needed a section of roof replaced entirely rather than patched, a cost they could now actually afford without the desperate scrambling that had characterized every repair in those first frantic months. "It's strange," Garrick said one evening, watching Maris work through the ledger she still kept faithfully, though its entries had shifted over the past year, from desperate tracking of survival measures to something closer to ordinary household accounting. Having problems that are just problems, not disasters waiting to finish us off. "It is strange," Maris agreed. "Good strange, though." "Good strange," he repeated, like he was testing the phrase, deciding whether he trusted it. "I think I could get used to that kind of strange." By midsummer, word had spread far enough beyond Ashmore Crossing that the Rowan Ranch had become something of a quiet local legend, the story of its turnaround told and retold with the usual embellishments small communities added to anything worth talking about. Though the core of it remained recognizable regardless of the telling, a ranch given up for failed, brought back from the edge of ruin by a woman who refused to accept that failure was inevitable, and a man who'd found, in her stubbornness, the will to fight for something he'd nearly let himself believe was already lost. It was this reputation, growing slowly but steadily through the valley, that brought Henrietta Cole to their door one autumn afternoon. A woman Maris didn't recognize at first, though something in her tired, determined bearing struck a chord of familiarity that took Maris a moment to place. "You don't know me," the woman said, standing in the yard with a small bundle of belongings and an expression that mixed desperate hope with the particular wariness of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "But I heard about this place. Heard about you, ma'am, specifically. How you came here with nothing and turned a dying ranch around through nothing but stubbornness and hard work." "That's roughly the truth of it," Maris said, studying the woman more closely. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Cole?" "Henrietta Cole. My husband passed last winter. Fever same as half the valley's been losing folks to these past years, and I've been trying to hold our place together alone since, 3 miles north of here, but I'm losing the fight, ma'am. Bank's already sent 2 warnings. I came because I heard you might know something about how a person fixes a place that looks past fixing, and I'm out of other ideas to try." Maris felt something shift in her chest. Recognition of her own desperate arrival here over a year before reflected back at her through this stranger's tired, hopeful face, and she found, without needing to consult Garrick first, that she already knew what her answer would be. "Come inside," she said. "Let's have some tea, and you tell me everything about your place, and we'll see what we can figure out together." What followed over the course of that autumn and into the following spring was the beginning of something neither Maris nor Garrick had quite anticipated when they'd first set out simply to save their own ranch. A kind of informal network of struggling families across the valley, drawn together by word of mouth and the simple, stubborn example the Rowan place had set. Each learning from the other's hard-won knowledge about drainage and feed stretching and fence salvage, and all the dozens of small, practical innovations that had carried the Rowan ranch back from the edge of ruin. Henrietta Cole's place, with Maris and Garrick's guidance and the same kind of trade-based community labor that had saved the Rowan field from the flood, slowly began its own recovery, and word of that success traveled further still, bringing 2 more struggling families to their door over the following year, each arriving with the same mixture of desperate hope and hard-earned skepticism that Maris herself had carried that first dusty afternoon. "We're not running a charity," Garrick said once, half joking, watching Maris spend yet another evening sketching out drainage plans for a neighboring property on a scrap of paper at their kitchen table. "No," Maris agreed. "We're running a trade, same as we always have. They give us labor when we need an extra hand at harvest, or seed they've managed to save when ours runs short, or whatever else they've got that we might need eventually. We give them what we learned the hard way, so they don't have to learn it quite so hard themselves." She looked up at him. "Does it bother you?" Being known for this now instead of just being known as the man whose ranch nearly failed? No, Garrick said, and there was no hesitation in it. I spent 3 years being known as the man whose ranch nearly failed, and feeling like that's all I'd ever be known as. I find I don't mind this new reputation nearly so much. The years that followed unfolded with the particular rhythm of a life that had found its footing, marked by the ordinary milestones that mattered more in their accumulation than any single dramatic event. A first child born the following autumn, a daughter they named Eleanor Grace, the middle name Maris's own idea, offered gently one evening when she noticed Garrick still sometimes stood a moment too long at the door of that small upstairs room that had once belonged to his first wife, a room they'd finally, together, cleared out and repurposed, with care and without erasing what it had once held, into a proper nursery. "You don't have to do that," Garrick had said when Maris first suggested the name, his voice thick. "You don't owe Eleanor anything." "I'm not doing it because I owe her anything," Maris said. "I'm doing it because she clearly loved this place and loved you, enough that some part of her is still woven into everything good that's grown here since. Seems right that our daughter carries a piece of that, alongside whatever she gets from the two of us." It was the kind of gesture that, Maris reflected later, captured something true about everything they'd built together. Not the erasure of what had come before, not a pretense that grief and loss hadn't shaped both their lives long before they'd met, but the steady, deliberate work of building something new on top of that foundation, honoring it rather than ignoring it. The way they'd rebuilt fences from salvaged wire, instead of pretending the old, broken fence had never existed at all. The ranch itself, by the time their daughter took her first unsteady steps across the same yard where Maris had once stood looking at broken fence posts and thin, struggling cattle, had become something genuinely remarkable within the valley. Not the largest operation in the county, never quite that, but widely regarded as among the best managed, the most reliably productive, the kind of place other ranchers pointed to when they wanted to make a point about what careful, patient work could accomplish, even against the worst odds. The herd had grown steadily but sustainably, never overextended, every expansion carefully weighed against what the land could actually support. The fences stood solid across every mile of the property, no longer the patchwork of salvaged wire and crooked posts from those early desperate months, but proper, well-maintained boundaries that Garrick walked with quiet pride rather than the grim, assessing worry that had once characterized every inspection. The drainage system Maris had first sketched in dirt with a stick, born of desperate necessity during one terrifying storm, had been refined and expanded over the years into something close to a model for the whole valley, copied and adapted by nearly every low-lying property in the area, and more than one traveling agricultural surveyor passing through the region on official business had stopped specifically to examine what the Rowan Ranch had built, taking notes back to report on elsewhere, a small practical legacy neither Maris nor Garrick had set out to create but had built regardless, simply by refusing to let one bad storm finish what 3 years of drought had started. Bertie Lunsford, growing older but no less sharp-tongued with the passing years, took to telling the story of the Rowan Ranch's turnaround to anyone new passing through Ashmore Crossing, embellishing it slightly more with each telling in the comfortable way of a woman who'd earned the right to claim a little ownership over a story she'd watched unfold with her own eyes. "Came here with nothing but a carpet bag and more stubbornness than sense," she told one such traveler, a young woman passing through who'd asked, out of simple curiosity, about the well-tended ranch visible from the road on the way into town. Whole Valley figured she'd be gone within a month, same as the 3 women before her. Instead, she turned the worst piece of failing land in this county into the best-run operation for 50 miles, married the rancher besides, and now half the struggling families in this valley owe their own survival, one way or another, to something she figured out first on the Rowan place. Bertie shook her head, something like wonder still present in her voice, even after years of telling the same story. "Goes to show, I suppose. A person willing to work hard enough and refuse to quit can turn around just about anything, given enough time and enough stubborn refusal to accept that failure is the only outcome on offer." It was a sentiment Maris herself had come to believe more deeply with each passing year, watching not just her own family's fortunes, but the fortunes of an entire small, struggling community shift, slowly but unmistakably, away from the quiet despair that had characterized the valley when she first arrived. Ashmore Crossing itself had changed in ways that went beyond any single ranch's recovery. New families had moved into properties that might otherwise have been abandoned. The general store Bertie ran had expanded enough to hire on help for the first time in years. Even the old church finally got its bell replaced, funded in part, though Maris never confirmed it outright, by contributions she suspected came quietly from the Rowan Ranch's own modest but growing prosperity. "You ever think about it?" Garrick asked her one evening, years into their marriage, the two of them sitting on the same mended porch steps, where he'd once told her he didn't know how to thank her for everything she'd done, watching their daughter chase fireflies across a yard that bore no resemblance anymore to the broken, neglected ground Maris had first walked across. What might have happened if you hadn't answered that notice? If you'd seen this place that first afternoon and just climbed back into the wagon, same as you said you wouldn't? "I think about it sometimes," Maris admitted. "I think you'd have lost the ranch eventually, probably within another year or two, the way things were going. I think you might have left this valley entirely, started over somewhere else, or maybe just given up trying to start over at all and settled into whatever smaller, sadder life was left once the bank finally took what remained." She reached over and took his hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing, years of shared work and shared life worn smooth between them like a stone polished by water. "And I think I'd have found some other position eventually, in some other city, doing work that paid the bills but never felt like it was building toward anything. I'd have survived. I'm stubborn enough that I generally do, but I don't think I'd have found anything close to what I found here, with you, in this particular mess of a ranch that nobody else wanted to take a chance on." "Lucky then," Garrick said, "that you took the chance instead of the other women who came before you." "Not luck," Maris said. "I don't put much stock in luck, same as I don't put much stock in curses. I think it was a choice. I chose to see this place as something worth fighting for instead of something already lost. And I think that choice, more than any luck, is what actually changed things. Here and everywhere else, this valley's seen things turn around since." Garrick was quiet a moment, watching their daughter's small, determined chase across the yard, fireflies blinking gold against the deepening blue of evening. "I think that's the truest thing you've ever said to me," he said finally. "And I've heard you say a great many true things over the years, so that's saying something." "High praise," Maris said, smiling. "Earned praise," Garrick corrected, and pulled her closer against his side, the two of them sitting together in a silence that no longer carried any trace of the desperate, uncertain quiet of those first difficult months, just the settled, easy comfort of two people who'd built, through hard work and stubbornness, and a refusal to accept that the worst outcome was the only possible one, a life genuinely worth the fight it had taken to build it. The story of the Rowan Ranch, as it came to be told and retold through Ashmore Crossing over the years that followed, never claimed to be a story about easy answers or simple solutions. And Maris herself, on the rare occasion she was asked to speak on it directly, usually by some new arrival to the valley hoping for advice on their own struggling property, made a point of saying so plainly. "There wasn't anything magic about what we did out here," she told one such visitor, a weathered, anxious man whose own small spread 2 valleys over had fallen on hard times, not unlike what the Rowan Ranch had faced years before. "We didn't find some clever trick that fixed everything overnight. We just refused to accept that the mess in front of us was permanent, and we worked at it, piece by piece, fence post by fence post, for longer than felt reasonable some days, longer than either of us had any guarantee would actually pay off in the end. Plenty of nights I went to bed not knowing for certain we'd still have a ranch come morning, let alone come the following year. The only thing I knew for certain, most of those nights, was that giving up guaranteed failure and trying at least left room for something better, even if better wasn't promised." "And if it hadn't worked?" the visitor asked. "If the storm had drowned your field anyway, despite everything you tried?" Maris considered that honestly, the way she considered most hard questions now, years of practice having taught her not to flinch from uncomfortable truths just because they were uncomfortable. "Then we'd have lost the harvest, and probably the ranch along with it eventually, and I expect I'd have grieved that loss same as I've grieved other losses in my life. But I don't think I'd have regretted trying. There's a particular kind of peace I've found in knowing you fought as hard as you could for something, even when the fighting doesn't guarantee the outcome you wanted. The alternative, sitting still and watching disaster arrive without lifting a hand against it, never sat right with me, not in the city and not out here either. I'd rather fail having tried everything than fail having tried nothing at all. And as it happens, this time, trying was enough. It isn't always, but it was enough often enough on this particular piece of land that I've come to believe it's nearly always worth the attempt. The man left that afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose, by his own later account, and went on to apply some of what Maris and Garrick had learned to his own struggling property, with results that, while never quite as dramatic as the Rowan Ranch's own turnaround, kept his own family afloat through what had looked, before that conversation, like certain ruin. It was one small story, among several, that accumulated over the years. Families across the valley who'd taken some piece of the Rowan Ranch's hard-won knowledge and applied it to their own circumstances. The original desperate gamble of one woman refusing to leave a failing ranch slowly rippling outward into something that resembled, in its quiet, unglamorous way, a kind of community resilience that hadn't existed in Ashmore Crossing before her arrival. Garrick, for his part, never stopped being somewhat amazed by the scale of what had grown from those first desperate weeks, even years later, watching his wife sit at their kitchen table sketching out drainage plans for some new struggling neighbor, or working through the practical math of feed rotation with a patience that had once been entirely foreign to a man who'd spent 3 years simply enduring his own life rather than actively shaping it. "You know," he said one evening, watching her work, their daughter long since put to bed, the house quiet around them in the particular comfortable way of a home that had earned its peace through years of hard work rather than simply inheriting it. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing Eleanor and watching this place fall apart right alongside her. Took me longer than it should have to understand that the worst thing wasn't losing her or losing the ranch's good years. The worst thing was what losing those things turned me into for those 3 years after. A man too afraid of more loss to risk trying for anything better. I'd given up on the idea that effort mattered, that work could actually change an outcome instead of just delaying an inevitable bad ending. And now?" Maris asked, looking up from her ledger. "Now I think the actual lesson, if there is one, isn't really about ranches or fences or drainage ditches at all," Garrick said slowly, working through a thought he'd clearly been turning over for a while. "It's that grief and hardship will try to convince a person that nothing they do matters anymore, that the world's already decided how things are going to end, and there's no point fighting against that ending. And the only real defense against that particular lie is exactly what you brought with you the day you climbed off that stagecoach. A flat, stubborn refusal to believe it, even when every visible piece of evidence seems to support it. You looked at the worst mess I'd ever let my own life become, and instead of agreeing with my own assessment that it was already finished, you simply decided it wasn't, and then you proved yourself right through nothing more complicated than refusing to stop trying." Maris set down her pen, considering that. "I think that's true," she said, "though I'd add one thing to it since you've gone and gotten philosophical on me tonight." "What's that?" "I couldn't have done any of it alone," Maris said. "I could refuse to give up all I wanted, but it was you choosing to fight alongside me instead of simply tolerating my stubbornness that actually turned this place around. And it was Otis Bell choosing to trade fairly instead of demanding charity, and Bertie riding out here to dig ditches alongside us in a storm she didn't have any obligation to help with, and a dozen other small choices made by people who didn't have to make them that built whatever this place has become. I think the real lesson, if I'm being honest, isn't really about one stubborn woman refusing to quit. It's about what happens when people refuse to let each other quit, when a whole struggling community decides together that nobody benefits from watching their neighbors fail just because failure was the easier outcome to expect." Garrick was quiet a moment, something thoughtful and warm in his expression. "That's a better lesson than mine." "It's not better," Maris said. "It's just the rest of the same lesson. Stubbornness gets a person started, but it's the people willing to stand alongside that stubbornness that actually carry it all the way through to something worth having." She closed her ledger, the day's work done, and reached for his hand across the table, the gesture as easy and certain now as it had been uncertain and new on that first night he'd asked her, plainly, what their arrangement actually meant to him. "I think that's worth remembering, whatever else this valley takes from our story as the years go on. Nobody builds anything worth having entirely alone. Not a ranch, not a marriage, not a community recovering from years of hard luck. It takes people choosing each other, again and again. Even when choosing each other costs something, even when the easier path would have been to simply let things fall apart and call it inevitable. Outside, the wind moved soft across fields that had once been cracked and dying, and were now, season after season, steady and productive, carrying with it none of the dry, hopeless weight it had carried that first afternoon Maris arrived, dust hanging in the air a moment too long over a town that had expected her to fail. The fences stood solid in the dark, 3 full miles of them, holding firm against whatever weather the coming seasons decided to bring. The barn roof, fully replaced now rather than merely patched, kept every drop of rain exactly where it belonged. And somewhere upstairs, in a room that had once sat closed and dusty and untouched, a little girl named for 2 women slept soundly, entirely unaware of how close the ground beneath her had once come to swallowing everything her parents had managed to build, secure instead in a home that had been fought for, piece by stubborn piece, by 2 people who'd refused against every reasonable expectation to let hardship have the final word. Ashmore Crossing itself, in the years that followed, became known throughout that part of the territory not as a forgotten, struggling settlement clinging to survival at the edge of the frontier, but as a small, resilient community that had somehow, against considerable odds, found its way back from the brink, its recovery so closely tied to the story of one ranch and one stubborn widow that the two had become, in the valley's collective memory, nearly inseparable. New families arriving in the area, looking to settle on land that had once seemed too risky given the valley's reputation, often heard the story of the Rowan Ranch before they heard much else, told to them by Bertie at the store, or by Otis Bell over a trade negotiation, or by Tobias, grown into a respected young rancher himself by then, married with children of his own, still fond of telling anyone who'd listen about the woman who'd ridden out to a dying ranch in his wagon, and refused, from the very first afternoon, to be frightened off by what she found there. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the harvest was secure and their daughter was asleep, Maris and Garrick would sometimes simply sit together on that same mended porch, watching the same hills that had once looked, to a tired, defeated man, like the edge of everything worth hoping for. And they understood, without needing to say it aloud anymore, that what they'd built together was never really about the fences or the cattle or the bank's grudging approval, though all of those things had mattered, desperately, at the time. What they'd built was something far simpler and far more durable than any of that. Proof, plain and lasting, that 2 people willing to refuse defeat, willing to work alongside each other through storms both literal and otherwise, could take the worst kind of broken thing and make it, slowly, patiently, into something whole again. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole and strong and entirely, unmistakably worth everything it had cost to build.